Pakistani native, proud of her rich cultural heritage.
She was bubbly, she was very pretty, she had a smile that could light up a room.
And soon she met a man who seemed like her perfect match.
He came from a very wealthy family. He had class, he had flair.
Together, they started a family of their own.
She was very devoted to her sons. They were the focus of her life, as well as her husband.
But in an instant, it would all be ripped away.
911, where's your emergency? I just got shot in my leg. Send an ambulance.
He said the gunman shouted something chilling.
Was someone driven by hate to commit this atrocious crime?
It looked like it was targeted.
Soon, detectives find themselves tangled in a sordid web of scandal and deceit.
She started to suspect him of having an affair.
She sent a text message that stated, "Someday you will find me dead."
Until finally, the full truth is revealed.
They're blown away at what she has to say.
He was contacting black magic companies, trying to put a spell on her.
He was a master manipulator.
They thought he was a psychopath before, but they realized they had barely scratched the surface.
August 16th, 2011. It's a tranquil Tuesday in Boonton, New Jersey, a bedroom community 30 miles west of Manhattan.
It's a very small and tight-knit community where everybody just kind of looks out for each other.
It's sort of a melting pot. It has a large Pakistani-American community that's been there for 50, 60 years.
The majority of the town are people of Islamic faith.
And for Boonton's Islamic residents, it's a particularly special time of year, the holy month of Ramadan.
Ramadan is a month of reflection, and we do a lot of good in that month, encouraged to help the needy, and we are obligated to fast. It's very common for people to break fast at sunset together.
Around 11 p.m., Ramadan festivities are wrapping up, and families are settling in for a quiet night. But a frantic 911 call from 26-year-old Kashif Pervez shatters the evening's calm.
Hello? 911, where's your emergency? I just got shot in my leg. Send an ambulance.
911 operators immediately dispatched Boonton police and medical to Kashif's location.
When first responders arrive, they're shocked to find what appears to be a young family gunned down in the middle of the quiet street.
Someone help her, please.
Thankfully, the baby's not harmed, not a scratch on him.
One officer immediately took the baby to the police cruiser to keep him safe.
What happened? Who did this to you?
I don't know. They ran away.
Thankfully, it appears that Kashif's injuries are non-life-threatening.
He was shot in the arm and the leg.
However, Kashif's wife, Nazish Noorani, isn't as fortunate.
Nazish was shot 3 times in the heart.
And they knew that it was probably too much for her body to take.
26-year-old Nazish Noorani had immigrated to the United States from Pakistan when she was just a teenager.
She was bubbly, she was very pretty, she dressed very well, she had a smile that could light up a room.
Nazish was a social butterfly, and because she was connected to her culture, she enjoyed attending cultural events.
And it was at one such event in 2005 that she met Kashif Pervez.
Kashif was also Pakistani, but he was born and raised here in the U.S.
Kashif was a very handsome young man coming from a very wealthy family. He had class, he had flair.
Kashif dreamed of being an architect, and he told Nazish that he was working on a master's degree at the prestigious Columbia University in New York City.
Kashif represented everything she would want in a husband.
Just months after meeting each other, the pair tied the knot and settled in Brooklyn. so Kashif could finish his studies at Columbia. And before long, their family of 2 started to grow.
Nazish and Kashif welcomed their first son in 2006 and their second one soon after.
She was just a loving mom who did everything to take care of her family and just be supportive of her husband and his dream to be an architect.
And as Kashif neared the end of his master's program, he got some more exciting news.
Babe. I got in. Look.
Harvard?
Yeah.
Oh my God. I'm so proud of you.
Kashif was offered an amazing opportunity to go to Harvard University.
Oh, what does this mean for us?
No reason to uproot the boys.
The plan was for Kashif to move to Boston and attend Harvard, while Nazish and the boys stayed back in Brooklyn.
Right, of course. You go. We'll be fine. It's only temporary.
Kashif and Nazish were willing to make the sacrifices necessary for them to have the life of their dreams.
And on August 16th, they reunited in Boonton, New Jersey to celebrate Ramadan with extended family.
Ramadan is a very happy time for the Muslim community.
But now, what started as a celebration has turned into a nightmare.
Nazish Noorani was dying on the street after having been shot in the heart.
Unfortunately, there's nothing paramedics can do to save Nazish's life.
No pulse.
No!
She's gone.
Oh God, no!
The bullets that struck her right in the chest.
Who would want to kill this beautiful young mother? And why?
Mr. Pervez tells first responders that they were ambushed by 3 gunmen wearing masks.
This wasn't random. They were profiling us.
Kashif says before the gunmen opened fire, they shouted something chilling.
They called them terrorists.
This was very serious. This was a possible hate crime.
Pakistani native Nazish Noorani had built a good life for herself in the U.S., along with her architect husband, Kashif Pervez, and their 2 young sons.
She was very devoted to her sons. They were the focus of her life, as well as her husband.
But now Nazish and Kashif have been gunned down by a group of masked attackers.
The wife was pronounced dead on the scene.
Kashif believes the violence was racially motivated.
This wasn't random. They were profiling us. They called us terrorists.
For police, this is a concerning piece of information.
It's the middle of Ramadan, the holiest month of the year for the Muslim community.
Because of Kashif and Nazish's Pakistani heritage, as well as their Muslim faith, this was something that police had to consider a possible hate crime.
Can't give any other descriptions on these guys. We'll need to know what to look for later.
There was 3 of them. One was black, one was white. That's all I know.
As first responders prepare to transport Kashif to the hospital, he walks them through the events of that evening.
He said they were in Boonton that particular night to celebrate Ramadan with family.
After dinner, he says he and Nazish decided to take a stroll through the neighborhood with their baby. Their oldest son chose to stay behind with Nazish's family.
Kashif says as they left his sister-in-law's house, everything seemed normal. But moments later, chaos erupted.
He said 3 masked men approached him. One was white, one was black, and he couldn't tell the other.
Please don't shoot. We don't have any money.
We don't want your money. We want you to go back to where you came from.
He said it hadn't been a robbery. It was targeted.
Kashif says before he had time to react and protect his wife and son, the masked men opened fire on them.
Go home, terrorists.
Kashif says the men took off, and he didn't see where they went.
At this point, Kashif was taken to the hospital as a result of the wounds that he received from this incident.
With the scene now secured, homicide detectives arrive to begin their investigation.
There really wasn't much evidence. There were some shell casings, but nothing else that really led the police in any particular direction.
The shell casings are clearly from two different firearms, a .38 caliber and 9mm, which fits with Kashif's statement that there were at least two shooters.
Comparing Nazish's wounds to Kashif's, it appears she was shot in the chest 3 times with a .38, which is a much larger bullet. There was no chance she was going to survive.
So was this indeed a hate crime? Were Kashif and Nazish targeted simply because of their Muslim faith?
Boomtown is a town where the Muslim community felt safe.
So police took this extremely serious. They wanted to make sure that no one else was in danger of being harmed because of this potential hate crime.
Just then, Nazish's family members arrive on the scene.
Nazish, where is she? Where's Kashif?
Kashif is in the hospital, ma'am. He's gonna be okay. But Nazish,
Please don't tell me that's her.
I'm so sorry.
The family was devastated. They had just seen her a few minutes ago. It was a very, very emotional moment.
They're experiencing the tragic loss of Nazish. She was a doting mom, a beautiful mom, a talented mom.
She was a wonderful person, really the light of their family.
Had Nazish or her husband been experiencing any racial prejudice that you're aware of?
What? No, never.
We always felt so safe in this neighborhood.
Things like this do not happen in Boonton, and certainly doesn't happen to people like Nazish and Kashif. It just didn't make sense. There had to be more to this story.
Can you think of anyone that would have wanted to harm Nazish?
No, everyone loved Nazish.
Almost everyone.
Nazish's family had some major concerns and suspicions.
Take a look at this.
Nazish sent a text message to her brother a couple of months ago that stated, "Someday you will find me dead. It will be Kashif. He wants to kill me."
Detectives in Boonton, New Jersey have just begun their investigation into the shooting of mother of two, Nazish Noorani, and her surviving husband, Kashif Pervez.
According to Nazish's husband, Kashif, the couple was shot by 3 bigoted strangers. But the family isn't so sure.
Police have just learned that Nazish's relationship with Kashif was on the rocks, so much so that he may have even wanted her dead.
Take a look at this.
Nazish actually sent a text message to her brother a couple of months ago that stated, "Someday you will find me dead. It will be Kashif. He wants to kill me."
When Kashif went to Harvard, he never came back as much as he said he would. Because Nazish thought that something was up.
Family tells detectives that while Kashif was living in Boston to go to Harvard, Nazish had started to suspect him of having an affair.
I knew it.
She saw something on social media with Kashif and another woman.
Kashif, who is Sarah?
I don't know anyone named Sarah.
Oh yeah, then who is this?
Oh, she's just a friend.
A friend? Yeah. A friend? Don't lie to me, Kashif.
When Nazish confronts Kashif, Kashif flew off the handle.
I've never lied. Stop accusing me of lying.
That's when the confrontation took a nasty turn.
She was punched in the stomach by Kashif.
I'm your husband. Never accuse me of lying.
Since the violent confrontation, Nazish's family says that she had grown terrified of Kashif.
Now, just because Kashif had hit his wife in the past, would he really go as far as to kill her? As well as shoot himself and try to cover it up?
Thank you for the information. We'll be in touch when we have more. Again, we're so sorry for your loss.
At this point, the detectives know that they need to talk with Kashif as soon as possible.
Detectives head to the hospital, where Kashif is currently receiving treatment for his injuries.
Kashif agrees to speak to detectives in his hospital room, and he starts out by repeating the same story he told officers on the scene.
He says the perpetrators of this offense approached him and his wife, called them terrorists.
However, as Kashif tells his story, detectives start to pick up on some inconsistencies with his initial statement.
So now Kashif indicates that the assailants, in this particular case, were all black men. So eyebrows went up with the investigators.
This is not what he said when he was first interviewed, so detectives are puzzled as to why Kashif's story changed so quickly.
When confronted, Kashif feels the heat and abruptly changes the subject to his wife, Nazish.
Kashif has a lot of negative things to say about Nazish. He really assassinated her character.
He's speaking about how selfish Nazish is and the fact that she always wants money.
You indicated there was always problems about money. She always wanted money, wanted you to give her all your money. Is that accurate? Right.
And when detectives ask Kashif about his alleged affair, he doesn't even attempt to deny it.
He tells them that Nazish drove him to cheat and that he had been involved with another woman named Sarah Khan for the last 5 years.
And you indicated to me that you really should not have gotten married. Right.
Suddenly, Kashif starts to break down and confess.
That's when the whole investigation changed.
He starts to tell the detectives that he doesn't want to go to jail, that he never meant for his wife to die.
You did not intend for this to happen.
Obviously not. This will never happen.
In a Boonton, New Jersey hospital room, 26-year-old Kashif Pervez is finally revealing what really happened to his murdered wife, Nazish Noorani.
During this interview with the detectives, Kashif finally admitted that he was cheating.
He admitted that he hated his wife and wished they weren't together. But Kashif says that what happened last night was all a terrible accident.
You did not intend for this to happen.
Obviously not. This will never happen.
Kashif now admits there were no masked assailants. There was no hate crime. He made it all up.
Kashif states, it's this guy, his name is Nomi To. He did it. He killed her.
Kashif explains that Nomi To is a truck driver he knows from Brooklyn.
I'm having a conversation with a friend of yours in Brooklyn, is that right?
Kashif explains he would often confide in Nomi about his problems.
He tells Nomi that he's having an affair, that his wife spends all his money, he doesn't love her anymore.
Kashif says he told Nomi that Nazish was standing in the way of his true love, Sarah Khan.
I mean, you know I can help you.
What do you mean?
Kashif says that's when Nomi made a shocking proposal.
I can help you get out. I'm good.
He would help him by getting rid of Nazish, by ending her life.
He says Nomi didn't even ask for money or anything in return. And Kashif was so desperate to get away from Nazish that he took him up on his offer.
Was there any moments when you and this person that you would go out for a walk with your wife? Yeah. Okay. And this person would come out, kill your wife, and ruin you? Right.
However, Kashif says that when the evening of August 16th rolled around, he started having second thoughts.
He immediately regretted that they had plotted this murder.
But it was too late.
Wait, no, change your plans! Wait!
Kashif tells detectives that they decided that he should be shot too, so that it would seem as if he was not involved in this crime.
Come on, man, you ready? Come on, man, let's go.
And now that it's all over and Nazish is dead, Kashif says he wishes he'd never gotten involved with Nomi Toe.
Kashif is telling detectives that he was really coerced by Nomi into committing this crime, that Nomi was the mastermind.
Based on what Kashif has told them, detectives need to find Nomi Toe. But Kashif doesn't give them much to work with.
He explains that Nomi Toe is the man's nickname because he's a tow truck driver. He doesn't know the man's real name.
Despite his confession, they need to allow Kashif to heal before they can arrest him and take him to jail. So for now, they decide to try and track down Nomi Toe.
Back at the station, detectives reach out to their contacts in Brooklyn to see if anyone has heard of a tow truck driver nicknamed Nomi Toe.
No one has ever heard of this Nomi.
They searched and searched but couldn't find any records of Nomi. At this point, detectives are starting to believe he doesn't even exist.
Nobody knew Nomi because there was no Nomi.
Detectives now suspect Kashif has lied to them. But what is he trying to hide? Or rather, who? With their search for Nomi Toe a dead end for now, detectives shift their focus.
Kashif told detectives that he was in fact being unfaithful to Nazish and having an affair with a woman named Sarah Khan. So naturally, detectives realized they have to track Sarah Khan down.
Hi. Yes. May I help you?
Yes, ma'am. Are you Sarah Khan?
Yes.
Sarah, do you know a man named Kashif?
Yes. He's my boyfriend.
According to Sarah, she'd met Kashif several years ago at a lecture in New York.
Sarah said when they met that he was separated from his wife and planning to get a divorce.
Sarah reveals to them that her and Kashif were together for 5 years. Kashif and Nazish were only married 6 years. So they realized the entire time Kashif and Nazish were married, he was also having an affair with Sarah.
It also means that he was lying to Sarah that whole time, living a double life with her while starting a family with his wife.
I'm sorry to tell you this, ma'am, but we have reason to believe that your boyfriend was involved in the murder of his wife.
Wait, his wife?
Yes, ma'am.
No.
During questioning, Sarah becomes upset, understandably so. She's learning that her boyfriend of 5 years is not only still married, he's not divorced, but that his wife was murdered.
Detectives continue to press Sarah, hoping to determine whether she knew anything about the plan to murder Nazish, or maybe even participated in it.
Was it possible Sarah wanted her out the picture so she could have him all to herself?
Look, listen, I've had enough. If you guys have any more questions, you guys can talk to my attorney.
She tells them she's done and asks them to leave.
If Sarah has nothing to hide, why won't she just answer their questions?
At this point, detectives are certain someone had to have helped Kashif with the murder. But as of now, they can't pinpoint who.
They decide to subpoena Kashif's phone records in hopes that he had communicated with his accomplice around the time of the murder.
And when those records come in, they reveal another surprising discovery.
They see a number that he is constantly texting, and that number is also texting him repeatedly.
The text messages right in the days before is clearly that they were plotting something.
One of those texts said, "You'll be free soon."
Detectives in Boonton, New Jersey have just discovered calls and text messages from Kashif Parvez's co-conspirator in the murder of his wife, Nazish Noorani.
They're quickly able to determine that the number doesn't belong to Sarah Khan.
Could it belong to the mysterious truck driver known only as Nomi Toe? That theory is quickly ruled out.
Based on the romantic content of many of the texts, it's clear the phone belonged to a woman, which means that Kashif had yet another mistress.
And in the days leading up to the murder, the messages turn from seductive to scheming.
The text messages right in the days before is clearly that they were plotting something.
One text is particularly chilling.
One of those texts said, "You'll be free soon."
But that's not all.
Right before the murders, detectives see a text message that said, "I'm parked right around the corner from Nazish's home."
They noticed that that same number was pinging off towers in New Jersey, right near the crime scene.
And after the murder, the phone traveled from Boonton across state lines and into Massachusetts, stopping at a town about 30 minutes from Boston, which is near where Kashif was studying at Harvard.
Detectives believe that whoever owns this phone is likely their shooter.
Then they're going to run that phone number, and you're going to see who it comes back to.
The number is registered to a 26-year-old woman named Antoinette Stephen.
She was a former student at Boston Architectural College.
Many of the pieces were coming together because Kashif was also studying architecture.
At this point, detectives are convinced Antoinette was involved in the murder of Nazish Noorani. With a search warrant in hand, they head to Antoinette's home to speak with her.
Antoinette Stephen?
Yes?
Mind if we ask you some questions?
Antoinette Stephen, when confronted by the police, agreed to speak with them.
She admits to knowing Kashif and confirms that they have a relationship, but she won't say much more than that.
Antoinette is not very forthcoming with information. She's pretty aloof, very neutral.
She denies having anything to do with the shooting that killed Nazish and injured Kashif.
But detectives aren't buying it.
Well, we have a warrant to search the premises.
What? Let me see that.
Please step aside.
And in Antoinette's bedroom closet, the investigators hit pay dirt.
They found in her closet, in a suitcase, 2 firearms that matched the shell casings to the scene.
Although they'll need ballistics testing to be sure, detectives are confident that these are the weapons used to kill Nazish and wound her husband.
Along with the phone records, the discovery of the guns gives detectives enough evidence to arrest Antoinette Stephen. That same day, Kashif is discharged from the hospital and arrested as well.
They were charged with murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and endangering the welfare of a child.
But even with 2 suspects now in custody, detectives still have a lot of questions.
Most importantly, detectives need to know which of the pair actually pulled the trigger.
As the case moves toward trial, investigators receive a promising call from Antoinette's attorneys.
Just homicide.
Once Antoinette realized that she was facing life without parole, she changed her tune. She was ready to talk.
She agrees to turn on Kashif and testify against him.
And as investigators sit down with Antoinette to hear her story, they're in for a wild ride.
They thought Kashif was a psychopath before, but they're blown away at what Antoinette has to say. They realized they had barely scratched the surface.
2 years after 26-year-old Nazish Noorani was shot and killed on the streets of Boonton, New Jersey, her husband Kashif Pervez and his secret mistress Antoinette Stephen are set to go to trial for the murder.
Investigators had uncovered text messages between the two plotting Nazish's death, and they had found a murder weapon hidden in Antoinette's closet.
But in exchange for a lighter sentence, Antoinette decides to flip on her lover.
That would be the final nail in the coffin to put Kashif away as the mastermind for Nazish's murder.
When Antoinette gives her updated statement, she doesn't hold back.
It all started back at architectural school.
They were classmates at that Boston Architectural College. That's how they met.
Antoinette explains that the relationship between her and Kashif was friendly at first, but eventually took a romantic turn.
She knew that he had a wife and children, but he said he was separated.
I wish we could spend every night like this.
Me too, honey. But it's not that simple.
According to Antoinette, Kashif told her separating from his wife would be easier said than done.
Within a Muslim marriage, it goes more than just going to the courthouse and getting a release of your legal responsibilities for one another.
But Antoinette says Kashif was desperate to get out of his marriage to Nazish.
Honestly, I don't know how much more I can take. You have no idea what she's really like.
He also told her a lot of negative things about Nazish, making her out to be a monster of a wife and a mother.
Kashif said that Nazish refused to get treatment for one of the sons who had sickle cell anemia, that she was neglecting and even abusing the children.
That's horrible. What kind of mother would do such a thing?
Right. I'm telling you, she's dangerous. I've been trying to get rid of her for years, but nothing's worked.
Antoinette says that's when Kashif made another shocking confession.
Years before the murder even occurred, he was contacting black magic companies to see if they could kill Nazish, trying to put a spell on her or have her poisoned.
He was going online to consult with voodoo practitioners and black magic practitioners to try to coerce Nazish into committing suicide.
He wasn't happy within the marriage in any way. He wanted to eliminate her well before he came up with the plot to eliminate her.
Listen, Antoinette. I need your help. If not for me, think of my son. She's killing him.
In Antoinette's mind, she believed Kashif. She wanted the boys to be safe from what she believed was Nazish's neglect and abuse.
So, I agreed to help him. He told me it was the only way.
She says she knew killing someone was wrong, but she genuinely thought she was doing it to help save the life of a sick child from his uncaring mother.
That night, I drove from Boston to Boonton. Then I waited.
However, when Kashif and Nazish emerged from her sister's home around 11 p.m., there was one problem.
The baby did not want to be left behind, and that threw Antoinette off. She wasn't expecting to see the baby, but she still carried out the plan.
Antoinette explains that she approached the young family and pointed the .38 pistol right at Nazish.
No, please, please, I have kids. I have kids. Please.
Do it! Do it! What are you waiting for?
Nazish's last heroic act demonstrated a mother's love. She threw her body in front of the stroller so that it did not roll down the hill and harm her son.
Then Antoinette switched to the smaller caliber gun to shoot Kashif in the leg and the arm.
I don't want to hurt you.
The cops are coming, come on!
Afterward, Antoinette fled, while Kashif called 911, pretending to be an innocent victim.
911, where's your emergency?
I just got shot in my leg. Send an ambulance.
The worst part is, I thought I was helping his son, but it turns out it was all a lie. His son was never even sick.
Neither of the children have sickle cell anemia, and Nazish never withheld any medical attention from them.
Kashif was a mastermind, a master manipulator. He was so good that he got a woman to kill for him.
And when Kashif Parvez's trial begins in May 2015, prosecutors are quick to expose even more of Kashif's lies.
Kashif's claims about being enrolled at Harvard and going to Columbia were also all lies.
I got in? Look!
Harvard?
Yeah!
Oh my God!
Neither school had any record of Kashif ever being a student there.
To bolster their claim of Kashif being a liar and manipulator, prosecutors call an unexpected witness to the stand, his first mistress, Sarah Khan.
Sarah testifies to the many lies Kashif had told her over the years, but that's not all.
Turns out Kashif was actually violent towards Sarah in the past, just like he was with Nazish.
But the most damaging testimony against Kashif comes from his accomplice, Antoinette Stephen.
On the stand, Antoinette has some shocking claims. She was absolutely psychologically abused by Kashif.
Antoinette testifies to how Kashif manipulated her into helping him get rid of his wife.
Divorce is just frowned upon in the whole culture.
So he convinced Antoinette that the only way he could be free was to kill Nazish.
After only 4 hours of deliberation, the jury comes back with their verdict: guilty.
Kashif is sentenced to life in prison.
He won't be eligible for parole until 2077.
Antoinette pleaded guilty to the murder, and she got a 30-year sentence.
She's not eligible for parole until 2041. And then she will most likely be deported back to India.
Through their devastation, Nazish's family is happy that justice has been served.
They were relieved. They said justice has been done. They weren't joyous, but they said justice has been done. We're satisfied.
But even though Kashif won't be able to hurt anyone else, it doesn't diminish the horror of what he did to his loving wife.
To plot to murder someone just to be with somebody else, that's psychopath thinking, not normal behavior.
It's so tragic when you have a beautiful, talented, intelligent young woman, and the only thing wrong that she did was fall in love and start a family with a man who was a monster.
For nearly half a century, she had no name, no family history attached to her remains, no confirmed identity, no photograph that investigators could place beside the grave and say, with certainty, this is who she was. She was known only as Jane Doe, a teenage girl whose body was discovered beneath California soil in 1978, leaving behind a mystery that would survive for generations. But in 2026, that mystery finally began to crack. Her name was Michelle Louise Collier. She was 15 years old, and for almost 50 years, her family had lived without knowing what had happened to her. The story began in February 1978 when Michelle disappeared from Fresno, California. She was a teenager. Her life, at least from the limited public record, was still unfolding in the ordinary rhythm of youth. Then she was gone. There was no modern digital trail to follow. No cell phone location, no social media messages, no network of electronic records capable of reconstructing her final movements. In 1978, an investigation depended heavily on physical evidence, eyewitnesses, paperwork, and human memory. When a young person disappeared, detectives had to work with what could be found and what people could remember. Every passing day made those memories more fragile. Every week created another opportunity for evidence to disappear, and Michelle's disappearance would become one of those cases in which time seemed to work against everyone searching for answers. Months after she vanished, the landscape near Arvin in Kern County became the scene of a discovery that would change the case forever. On June 21st, Sill 1978, a tractor operator working in a vineyard near South Wheeler Ridge Road encountered something beneath the ground. The machinery disturbed a shallow grave. What was uncovered was not an abandoned object or an ordinary piece of debris. It was human remains. Investigators were called to the scene. The discovery immediately raised a terrifying possibility. Somewhere, someone had lost a loved one. Somewhere, there could be a missing person report describing this young victim. Somewhere, there could be a family waiting for a phone call that had never come. But the first problem was devastatingly simple. Investigators did not know who she was. The remains belonged to a young female, but her identity could not immediately be established. In the late 1970s, forensic science was nowhere near where it is today. DNA profiling was not yet available as the powerful investigative tool it would eventually become. Modern genetic genealogy did not exist. Databases containing millions of genetic profiles were decades away. Investigators had to rely on the techniques available to them at the time. Fingerprints were examined. Dental information could potentially provide clues, but nothing produced the answer. The unidentified teenager became a Jane Doe. She was eventually buried at Arvin Cemetery. The case remained open, but the victim remained nameless. That detail is difficult to understand from the perspective of the modern world. Today, when an unidentified body is discovered, investigators can potentially compare DNA, dental records, fingerprints, missing person databases, genealogy records, and countless other sources of information. But in 1978, the options were far narrower. The victim could be physically present, yet her identity could remain completely hidden. And that is exactly what happened to Michelle. Her remains became evidence in a homicide investigation, but the person behind the evidence was invisible. The years began to move. 1 became 5. 5 became 10, then 20. The world around the case changed dramatically. Technology advanced. Police departments changed. Investigative methods evolved. But the grave at Arvin Cemetery remained connected to a question that had never been answered. Who was this girl? For Michelle's family, the disappearance was a different kind of nightmare. When someone disappears without explanation, there is no clean ending. There is no certainty. There is always the possibility that the missing person might somehow return. Families can spend years living between hope and grief. They may wonder where the person went, whether they are alive, whether someone knows something, whether a forgotten clue might someday emerge. But in Michelle's case, the family did not know that her remains had already been discovered. They did not know that investigators had already encountered the end of her life. They did not know that the unidentified teenager buried in Kern County was their missing 15-year-old daughter and sister. The case had effectively split into 2 stories. There was Michelle, the missing girl from Fresno, and there was Jane Doe, the unidentified teenager found near Arvin. For decades, nobody could prove that those two stories were the same story. Then, in 2007, investigators returned to the case. This time, they had something the original investigators could never have used: modern DNA technology. But there was a problem. A DNA sample had not been collected during the original investigation. To obtain biological material suitable for modern analysis, the remains were exhumed. It was a remarkable step in a case that had already survived almost 3 decades. The remains were brought back into the investigative process, and DNA testing was pursued. The hope was straightforward. If investigators could develop a genetic profile, perhaps they could compare it against missing person records or relatives and finally identify the teenager. The sample was submitted to the California Department of Justice, but once again, the case encountered the wall that had stopped it for decades. There was no match that could provide the victim's identity. The DNA existed, the evidence existed, but the name remained missing. This was one of the cruel realities of cold case investigation. Having DNA does not automatically mean having an answer. A genetic profile is powerful only when investigators have something meaningful to compare it against. Without a known relative or matching database entry, the profile can remain an anonymous string of biological information. The science had moved forward, but the case was still trapped in the past. Then investigators tried another approach. In 2015, a forensic facial reconstruction was created from the unidentified girl's remains. The goal was to give the public something recognizable. Instead of a skull or skeletal description, there would be a reconstructed face. A teenage girl could finally be seen again. Perhaps someone would look at that face and recognize a daughter, a sister, a friend, a classmate. Perhaps someone would remember a girl who disappeared decades earlier. But the reconstruction did not immediately produce the answer. The face was visible. The name was not. Michelle remained unidentified. And as another decade passed, the case became an increasingly painful example of how even determined investigators can be defeated by the limitations of technology. But the science was changing again. Around the country, investigators were beginning to use forensic investigative genetic genealogy to revisit unidentified remains and long unsolved homicides. Instead of requiring a direct DNA match, investigators could search for biological relatives and work backward through family relationships. It was a fundamentally different strategy. A victim did not need to already exist in a database under her real name. Her relatives might provide the connection. A distant cousin could become the first thread. That thread could lead to another branch of a family tree, and eventually those branches could converge on one person. In Michelle's case, that possibility became real in 2025. Investigators continued working with the available evidence and turned to advanced DNA testing. The Kern County Sheriff's Office worked with the California Department of Justice and other agencies, while forensic specialists at Othram analyzed the biological evidence. A usable DNA profile was developed. Genetic genealogy could now be applied to the mystery that had resisted identification for nearly 50 years. The process required patience. It required genealogical research, comparison, verification, and investigative confirmation. It was not simply a computer producing a name. Scientists and investigators had to establish that the genetic connections actually pointed toward the correct person. Eventually, the evidence led investigators to Michelle Louise Collier, a girl who had disappeared from Fresno in February 1978, a teenager whose remains had been discovered months later near Arvin, a victim whose identity had been hidden from her family and the public for decades. Suddenly, the Jane Doe case had a name. The announcement was extraordinary because it solved only one part of the mystery while making the remaining question even more urgent. Michelle had been identified. But who killed her? The discovery of her identity did not produce an arrest. It did not reveal the person responsible for her death. It did not explain exactly what happened between the moment Michelle disappeared and the moment her remains were discovered buried in the vineyard. Those questions remain. After nearly 50 years, investigators finally knew the name of the girl at the center of the case. But the person responsible for her death was still out there, unidentified. And that meant the case was no longer simply about finding Jane Doe. It was about finding justice for Michelle Louise Collier, a 15-year-old girl who vanished in 1978, a teenager whose identity survived beneath the soil for almost half a century, a name that technology finally recovered from the darkness, but a mystery that still refuses to disappear. The name Michelle Louise Collier changed everything, but it did not answer the question that had haunted the case from the beginning. For decades, investigators had been staring at an unidentified victim. Now they knew who she was. That single fact transformed the investigation from a search for a name into a search for a story. Michelle was not simply Jane Doe. She was a 15-year-old girl from Fresno who had disappeared in February 1978. Her remains were discovered months later in Kern County, buried in a vineyard near Arvin. Somewhere between those 2 points in time was the missing chapter of her life. That chapter contained the answer investigators still needed. What happened to Michelle after she disappeared? How did a teenager from Fresno end up in a shallow grave near Arvin? And most importantly, who was responsible for her death? To understand why the case remains so difficult, it is important to remember the world in which Michelle vanished. California in 1978 was a very different place. There were no smartphones recording movements, no GPS history, no social media accounts documenting friendships and conversations, no massive digital databases capable of instantly connecting a missing person report to evidence discovered hundreds of miles away. Investigators worked with paper files, photographs, physical records, interviews, fingerprints, dental information, and whatever witnesses could remember. If someone disappeared without leaving behind a reliable trail, investigators could be forced into an almost impossible search. And if that person was later found unidentified, the two investigations could remain separated by a wall of uncertainty. That wall stood between Michelle and her family for decades. When her remains were discovered near Arvin, investigators knew they had found a homicide victim, but they did not know the victim's name. When Michelle's family searched for their missing teenager, they did not know that authorities had already recovered her remains. The connection existed in reality, but not in the records. That is one of the most disturbing features of unidentified person cases. The truth can exist without anyone knowing how the pieces fit together. A body can be found. A missing person can be reported. Two sets of investigators can work separately. Years can pass, and the victim can remain trapped between two incomplete stories. Michelle's case entered that space. The discovery on June 21st, still 1978, had already created a mystery. A tractor operator was working in a grape vineyard near South Wheeler Ridge Road outside Arvin when the machinery disturbed a shallow grave. Investigators arrived and recovered human remains. The victim was a young female, but the grave did not provide the identification they needed. There was no simple answer waiting beneath the soil, no document bearing a name, no immediate connection to a missing person case. Instead, investigators were left with the remains of a teenager whose life had been violently interrupted. The physical evidence could tell them some things, but it could not tell them everything. Modern forensic identification techniques were still far in the future. The case eventually reached a point where the victim could be buried, but not truly identified. She was laid to rest at Arvin Cemetery. Even the language used to describe her carried the tragedy of anonymity. Jane Doe, two words used when the most fundamental fact about a person is unknown. The girl had a biological identity, a family, a history, memories, relationships, and a name. But investigators could not access any of those things. To the outside world, she was an unidentified victim. To her family, somewhere in Fresno, a 15-year-old girl was still missing. The years that followed only deepened the mystery. Investigators could not simply reopen the case every few months and expect new evidence to appear. There was no technological revolution waiting in the next police report. The case had to survive through institutional memory. Detectives retired. Personnel changed. Records aged. Evidence had to be preserved. And yet the case did not completely disappear. The unidentified teenager remained part of the investigative record. When technology advanced enough to make a new attempt possible, investigators returned to her. In 2007, nearly 30 years after the discovery, the remains were exhumed. This was not a symbolic gesture. It was an attempt to recover biological evidence that had not been collected during the original investigation. Modern DNA testing offered something investigators in 1978 could barely have imagined. A biological profile could potentially provide a direct path to identity. The remains were examined and DNA was obtained. The profile was submitted to the California Department of Justice, but the anticipated breakthrough did not come. There was no match that immediately revealed the girl's identity. The technology could generate information, but information was not the same as identification. The DNA belonged to someone. That much was certain. But without a reference point, investigators still had no name. This distinction became critical in Michelle's case. People sometimes imagine DNA as a magical fingerprint that automatically produces a suspect or a victim's identity. Real forensic work is more complicated. DNA can establish relationships, exclude individuals, connect evidence, or generate leads, but investigators need databases, comparison samples, or other usable information. In a case almost 30 years old, the absence of a direct family reference could be enough to leave a genetic profile sitting in the system without an answer. The Jane Doe case remained open. Then came another attempt to make the unidentified girl recognizable. In 2015, investigators created a forensic facial reconstruction based on the remains. It was an effort to reverse the anonymity. For decades, the public had no face to associate with the victim. Now there was an approximation of what she may have looked like. The image represented something profoundly human. It was no longer simply a set of bones. It was a teenage face, a face that might trigger recognition in someone who had known Michelle. The reconstruction was another attempt to bridge the gap between evidence and memory. But once again, the case resisted. No immediate identification followed. The face was visible, but the name remained hidden. Another decade began, and during those years, forensic science continued to evolve. Investigative genetic genealogy became one of the most significant developments in the search for unidentified victims. The method could take a DNA profile and search for genetic connections that might lead investigators toward relatives. Instead of waiting for the victim's own DNA to appear in a database, investigators could potentially find someone related to the victim. That could create a family tree. The family tree could narrow the possibilities, and investigators could then compare those possibilities against the known facts of the case. It was painstaking work, but it offered something traditional DNA matching could not: a path forward when no direct match existed. In Michelle's case, investigators eventually turned to this technology. In 2025, advanced testing was performed on evidence connected to the unidentified victim. Othram, a forensic laboratory specializing in difficult DNA cases, worked to develop the genetic profile necessary for further investigation. The work was part of a broader effort involving the Kern County Sheriff's Office, the California Department of Justice, and National Missing Person Resources. What had once been a case defined by absence now contained a new kind of evidence. The DNA profile could be used to search for relationships. The investigators could begin moving backward through generations. Somewhere in the family tree was the connection to the unidentified girl buried in Arvin. The breakthrough did not happen because someone suddenly remembered a forgotten detail. It happened because technology had finally become capable of asking the question differently. Instead of asking, "Who is this unknown teenager?" investigators could ask, "Who is genetically connected to this teenager?" That distinction opened a new investigative path. Genetic genealogy is not an instant solution. It requires analysis, careful research, and confirmation. A potential family connection is only a lead. Investigators must verify the relationship and make sure the person identified is actually the victim. In a case that had already lasted decades, there was no room for another mistake. Eventually, the evidence pointed toward Michelle Louise Collier. Her identity was confirmed. The girl known for decades only as Jane Doe was finally restored to her family. But the identification created an emotional contradiction. It was a breakthrough, yet it was also a confirmation of death. For Michelle's loved ones, the mystery of where she was had finally ended. The uncertainty that had lasted almost 50 years had been replaced by a terrible certainty. She had been found long ago. She had been buried in Arvin. Her family simply had not known. The discovery also changed the language of the investigation. Authorities no longer had to describe an unknown teenager found in a vineyard. They could speak about Michelle. They could search her history. They could examine the circumstances of her disappearance. They could ask people who may have known her what they remembered. The investigation finally had a human scent, but there was another problem. Nearly 50 years had passed. Memories fade. People move. Records disappear. Witnesses may no longer be alive. Circumstances that were obvious to investigators in 1978 may be difficult to reconstruct today. Yet time can also produce unexpected evidence. People who once remained silent may decide to speak. Old relationships may become clearer. Records that were previously inaccessible may become searchable. And advances in forensic science can sometimes extract information from evidence that investigators could not interpret decades earlier. Michelle's identification, therefore, did something remarkable. It did not close the case. It gave the case a new beginning. The unknown girl had become Michelle Louise Collier, 15 years old, missing from Fresno, found in Kern County, buried beneath California soil. Her name had finally returned, but her killer had not. And that meant the most important mystery of all was still waiting. Somewhere between Michelle's disappearance in February 1978 and the discovery of her remains on June 21st, investigators believe the events occurred that ultimately ended her life. The exact circumstances remain unresolved publicly. No suspect has been announced. No arrest has brought the case to court. The person responsible has never stood before a jury. For nearly 50 years, the investigation could not even begin with the victim's real identity. Now, it can. And that changes the possibility. The question is no longer simply whether Michelle can be identified. She has been. The question is whether the evidence that survived nearly 5 decades can now tell investigators what happened to her. Her name is no longer missing. Her story is still incomplete. For nearly 50 years, one of the most important facts in the case was missing. Not the location where the victim was found. Not the date the remains were discovered. Not even the fact that investigators believed they were dealing with a homicide. The missing fact was the identity of the girl herself. She was a teenager. She had been buried in a vineyard outside Arvin. She had disappeared before her remains were discovered. But nobody could connect those pieces to a real person. Then the name Michelle Louise Collier finally emerged, and the case suddenly became personal. A photograph could now have a name beneath it. A missing person report could be connected to human remains. A family could finally understand what had happened to a daughter and sister who had disappeared in 1978. But identification also exposed how much investigators still did not know. Michelle had been missing since February. Her remains were discovered on June 21st. Between those two dates was a period of uncertainty that had lasted almost half a century. It was the space where the answers were supposed to be. It was also the space where the killer had disappeared. The discovery of the remains near Arvin had immediately raised questions. Why was a teenage girl buried there? Who had access to the location? How long had she been in the ground? Who knew she was there? Was the burial site chosen deliberately, or was it simply a place where someone believed the body would remain hidden? Investigators in 1978 had to confront those questions without the tools available today. They could examine the physical evidence. They could document the scene. They could attempt to determine the victim's identity. But the most important link, the connection between the unidentified remains and a missing teenager in Fresno, was missing. That missing connection was devastating. A homicide investigation is built around a sequence of events. Investigators need to understand who the victim was, where she was before her death, who knew her, where she went, and what happened during her final hours or days. Without a name, every one of those questions becomes harder. A victim's personal history can be one of the most important sources of investigative information. Friends can remember conversations. Family members can identify relationships. Teachers can describe behavior. Neighbors can remember unusual activity. Employers can provide records. Missing person reports can establish timeline, but when the victim is unknown, investigators have none of that. The victim becomes isolated from her own life. That was Michelle's situation for decades. Her family knew that she had disappeared, but investigators working on the Jane Doe case did not know that the girl in their custody was Michelle. The two investigations existed separately. The missing girl from Fresno and the unidentified victim from Kern County were connected by reality, but not by evidence that investigators could prove. That changed only when modern forensic science began rebuilding the connection. The first major technological attempt came decades after Michelle's death. In 2007, investigators exhumed the remains so that DNA could be obtained. The decision showed that the case had not been forgotten. Investigators were willing to disturb a grave nearly 30 years after the discovery because there was still a possibility that modern science could succeed where earlier methods had failed. The remains were tested and a genetic profile was developed. The California Department of Justice received the profile, but there was no direct identification. The case remained unresolved. That failure was not the end of the scientific investigation. It demonstrated the limits of the available databases. DNA could provide a powerful biological signature, but a signature without a reference could remain anonymous. Investigators needed a connection, and for years, that connection did not exist. Then came forensic facial reconstruction. In 2015, investigators attempted to recreate the face of the unidentified teenager. The process was another bridge between the evidence and the public. A person who had been represented only by skeletal remains could now be imagined as a living teenager. The reconstructed face could potentially trigger a memory. Someone might recognize her. Someone might remember seeing a similar girl. Someone might connect the image to an old disappearance, but no decisive identification followed. The mystery remained. Years passed again, and this is where the story of Michelle's case becomes a story about the transformation of forensic science itself. In the decades after her disappearance, DNA technology evolved from a developing scientific technique into one of the most important tools in modern criminal investigations. But even traditional DNA matching has limitations. If the victim's DNA does not match a known individual or a close relative in a database, the investigation may still reach a dead end. Investigative genetic genealogy changed that equation. It allowed investigators to search for genetic relationships and use those relationships to build family trees. In an unidentified person case, this could be revolutionary. A distant relative could become the first clue. A family connection could narrow the possibility. Genealogical research could then reveal a person whose age, location, and disappearance fit the evidence, but the process required investigators to combine science with traditional detective work. DNA could identify relationships. Researchers still had to interpret those relationships. They had to examine records, verify family structures, and eliminate possibilities. Every potential identification needed confirmation. That careful process became critical when the Kern County investigation returned to Michelle's case. By 2025, investigators were using advanced testing to pursue the identity of the teenager whose remains had been found decades earlier. Othram worked with the genetic material to develop a forensic profile suitable for investigative genealogy. The Kern County Sheriff's Office and the California Department of Justice were part of the broader effort to finally answer the question that had survived since 1978. The process eventually led investigators to Michelle Louise Collier, a 15-year-old from Fresno, missing since February 1978. The unknown girl buried at Arvin Cemetery was no longer unknown. The identification was officially announced in 2026. For Michelle's family, the moment represented something they had waited decades to receive: certainty. But certainty can be complicated. A missing person identified after almost 50 years is not a simple happy ending. It is an answer to one question that creates countless others. Where was she? What happened to her? Who knew her after she disappeared? Who was with her? Why was she taken to Kern County? Who buried her? Why was she buried there? And what does the surviving evidence reveal about the person responsible? Those questions become even more important because Michelle was only 15. She was not an anonymous adult passing through an unknown place. She was a child whose disappearance should have mattered immediately. Her family should have known where she was. Her community should have known what happened. Instead, her identity became buried alongside her remains. The discovery of the body in June 1978 was itself a shocking event. A young girl had been hidden in the ground. The fact that she remained unidentified made the case even more difficult. The investigators could not tell the public who to look for. They could not easily connect the victim to a missing person report. They could not ask the right people whether they had seen her. The case existed, but the victim's identity was outside it. Now, almost 5 decades later, that barrier has been removed. Michelle's name provides investigators with something they did not have in 1978, a history. Her disappearance from Fresno can be examined alongside the discovery near Arvin. Investigators can look at the people who knew her. They can examine records associated with her life. They can revisit old information with the knowledge that the Jane Doe was Michelle. Every detail that once belonged to a missing person investigation can now potentially become relevant to a homicide investigation. This is one of the most important consequences of identifying an unknown victim. Identification does not merely give the victim a name, it changes the investigative universe surrounding the case. Suddenly, every relationship can matter. Every location can matter. Every old memory can be reconsidered. A detail dismissed in 1978 might look different today. A person who was never connected to the Jane Doe investigation might now become relevant because they knew Michelle. A document that once seemed unrelated might become part of a timeline. The identification can create new questions that investigators could never have asked before. Yet time remains the enemy. People who were adults in 1978 are now elderly, others have died. Memories that once seemed sharp have faded. Physical locations have changed. Buildings may have disappeared. Roads may have been altered. The vineyard landscape itself may no longer resemble what investigators saw in 1978. Every year that passes can erase another piece of the original story. That is why the identification of Michelle matters so much. It restores the starting point. The case now has a victim with a known identity and a known disappearance. Investigators no longer have to search the entire universe of missing teenagers. They can focus on one girl and the people and circumstances surrounding her life. But the most important evidence may still be hidden somewhere in the past. The person who killed Michelle may have carried that secret for decades. They may have believed that the passage of time would make the case impossible to solve. For almost 50 years, the investigation appeared to prove that assumption: the victim was unidentified. The killer remained unidentified. The case sat in the cold case world, waiting for technology to catch up with the evidence. Then DNA did something that time could not prevent. It gave Michelle her identity back. It did not erase the decades. It did not restore the life she should have lived. It did not reveal the killer, but it changed the case from an unidentified homicide into the murder of a named 15-year-old girl. And that distinction mattered, because now the investigation has a name to protect, a family to remember, and a history to reconstruct. The question that once seemed impossible to answer, who was Jane Doe, has finally been solved, but the answer has exposed the question that remains. Who killed Michelle Louise Collier? Nearly 50 years later, that question still hangs over the case. And unlike Michelle's identity, it cannot be solved finding her name. It will require someone to remember, someone to speak, something to be uncovered, or another piece of evidence to emerge from a past that has remained silent for far too long. The most haunting thing about Michelle Louise Collier's case is not simply that she disappeared, and not simply that her remains were discovered months later in a California vineyard. It is that for almost 50 years, investigators knew a young girl had been murdered, but they did not know who she was. Her identity was locked away inside evidence that could not yet speak. That meant the investigation was forced to move forward without the most basic piece of information a homicide detective needs: the victim's name. When Michelle disappeared in February 1978, the people who knew her knew exactly who they were looking for. Her family knew her face. They knew her voice. They knew her age. They knew the life she had been living in Fresno. But investigators examining the remains discovered near Arvin in June had none of that information. They had a teenage victim and a grave. They had a death, but not a biography. And that distinction would shape the entire investigation for decades. The discovery itself was unsettling. On June 21st, still 1978, a tractor operator working in a grape vineyard near South Wheeler Ridge Road outside Arvin disturbed the earth, uncovered a shallow grave. The machinery had reached into the ground and exposed evidence of a hidden crime. Investigators arrived and began the difficult process of documenting what had been found. The remains belonged to a young female, but the person who had buried her had left investigators with almost no easy path toward identification. There was no modern DNA database to search, no investigative genetic genealogy, no nationwide system capable of instantly connecting unidentified remains with missing person cases. The technology that would eventually solve the identity did not yet exist. The case therefore became a race against time before anyone even understood that it would last for decades. Investigators had to work with what the remains could tell them. They examined physical characteristics. They considered fingerprints and dental information. They tried to determine whether the victim might correspond to a missing person. But the answer remained out of reach. The teenager was eventually buried at Arvin Cemetery. A grave existed. A victim existed. But a name did not. Somewhere in Fresno, a family continued to live with the disappearance of a 15-year-old girl. The possibility that the two cases were connected remained hidden. That is what made the passage of time so devastating. Every year without an identification meant another year in which Michelle's family could not know where she was. It also meant another year in which investigators could not fully reconstruct her final days. The case became frozen. The evidence remained, but the context surrounding it faded. People who might have known Michelle could move away. Witnesses could forget details. Friends could lose contact, records could become difficult to locate, and investigators themselves could retire. Cold cases often survive because evidence survives, but evidence without context can become almost impossible to interpret. In Michelle's case, one of the most important pieces of context, the victim's identity, was missing. Then, nearly 3 decades after the remains were discovered, investigators made a decision that demonstrated the case was still alive. In 2007, Michelle's remains were exhumed so that biological material could be collected for modern DNA testing. It was a significant step. Investigators were essentially returning to the beginning, reopening the physical evidence, and asking modern science to attempt what earlier investigators could not. DNA offered the possibility of an objective identification. If Michelle's genetic profile could be developed, investigators could compare it with available records or relatives. The remains were tested, and a profile was submitted to the California Department of Justice. Yet there was still no immediate answer. The profile existed, but it did not generate the identification investigators needed. This is where the case entered another period of silence. The technology had produced evidence, but the evidence could not yet produce a name. The unidentified girl remained unidentified. In 2015, investigators tried another method. A forensic facial reconstruction was created from the remains. The goal was to produce an image that could be shown to the public. Instead of an anonymous skeleton, there would be a reconstructed face. The hope was that recognition might come from somewhere unexpected. Someone might look at the image and remember a teenager from decades earlier. Someone might compare it with an old photograph. Someone might recognize the features. But again, the breakthrough did not come. The face existed, but the identity remained hidden. It was another reminder that solving a cold case often depends on several independent pieces of information coming together at exactly the right time. A reconstruction alone was not enough. A DNA profile alone was not enough. A missing person investigation alone was not enough. The pieces needed to connect, and the connection would eventually come from a technology that did not exist when Michelle disappeared. Investigative genetic genealogy began changing the way unidentified remains were approached. Instead of waiting for a direct match in a conventional DNA database, investigators could use genetic relationships to identify relatives. A distant relative could become the first link. From there, genealogists could construct family trees. Those trees could be compared with known information about the unidentified victim. The process was painstaking. It required scientific analysis, genealogical research, and investigative confirmation. But it offered something the earlier investigation did not have: a way to work backward from biology to identity. By 2025, investigators were applying advanced DNA testing to Michelle's case. Othram, a forensic laboratory in Texas, worked to develop a genetic profile from the evidence. The Kern County Sheriff's Office and the California Department of Justice were involved in the renewed effort. The case had already survived almost half a century. Now investigators had another opportunity. The genetic material could potentially reveal family relationships that traditional database searches had missed, and eventually, those relationships led to Michelle. Her identity was confirmed in 2026. The Jane Doe buried at Arvin Cemetery was Michelle Louise Collier, 15 years old, missing from Fresno since February 1978. The announcement was more than a forensic success. It was the restoration of a person's identity after decades of anonymity. For Michelle's family, the discovery finally provided an answer to the question that had dominated their lives, but it also carried a devastating truth. The missing teenager they had hoped might somehow still be alive had been dead for almost 50 years. Her remains had been found months after she disappeared. Her family had been living without that knowledge. The identification therefore ended one form of uncertainty while opening another. The question now became much sharper: who killed Michelle? The public record surrounding the case still does not provide a definitive answer. Authorities have not publicly identified a killer. There has been no announced arrest connected to her death. The homicide remains unresolved. That means investigators are now working from a fundamentally different position than the one they had in 1978. They know the victim. They know her age. They know where she disappeared from. They know where her remains were found. They have DNA evidence. They have nearly 50 years of accumulated investigative history, and they have modern forensic techniques that were unimaginable when the original investigation began. But time has created another obstacle. A person who might have been questioned in 1978 could be difficult to locate today. A witness who saw something may have forgotten it. A person who knew Michelle may have died. An old address may no longer exist. A business may have disappeared. A vehicle may have been destroyed decades ago. A telephone number recorded in a paper file may lead nowhere. The physical world has changed around the evidence, yet the murder itself has not changed. The victim remains the same. The location where she was found remains part of the history, and the person responsible, if still identifiable through surviving evidence, remains connected to what happened. This is the strange power of a cold case. Time can bury facts, but it cannot change the underlying event. Someone killed Michelle. Someone placed her remains in a shallow grave. Someone knew something about her disappearance. Someone may have carried knowledge of the crime for decades. And now, for the first time, investigators can approach those questions with Michelle's identity in hand. Her name may also change the way old evidence is interpreted. A detail from her missing person report could become important. A person who was once only a distant acquaintance could become relevant. A location that previously seemed unrelated could suddenly matter. The identification creates a new investigative framework. It gives detectives a chance to reconstruct Michelle's life before she vanished and compare that history with the circumstances surrounding the discovery of her remains. But the case remains a race against time. Every year that passes reduces the number of people who can personally remember 1978. Every year creates more distance between the investigators of the original case and those working today. Yet the investigation has something it did not have before. It has a name. It has a confirmed identity. And perhaps most importantly, it has a family who no longer has to wonder whether Michelle was ever found. She was found. She had been there all along. Her name was hidden by the limitations of an earlier era of forensic science. Modern DNA finally broke through that barrier, but DNA cannot automatically tell investigators everything. It can identify relationship. It can create leads. It can connect evidence. The rest of the story still has to be reconstructed, and that reconstruction now begins with Michelle herself. 15 years old, a teenager from Fresno. missing in February 1978, found months later in a vineyard near Arvin, unknown for 48 years, identified through modern genetic investigation, and still waiting for the final question to be answered. Who took her life? The answer may be buried somewhere in old memories, old records, surviving evidence, or the conscience of someone who has lived with the secret for almost half a century. The name Jane Doe has disappeared from the center of the investigation. Michelle Louise Collier has taken its place, and with that name comes something the killer could not erase, the possibility that the past is finally beginning to speak. For decades, the case had been defined by an absence, no confirmed identity, no family connection, no clear path back to the girl's life. The remains found in the Arvin vineyard had become a permanent reminder that someone had died violently, but the person behind those remains remained unknown. Then Michelle Louise Collier was identified, and suddenly the absence became a history. A missing person case and a homicide case could finally be placed on the same timeline. February 1978 was no longer simply the month when an unidentified teenager vanished from the public record. It was the beginning of Michelle's final known chapter. June 21st. Still, 1978 was no longer simply the date when a tractor operator discovered a shallow grave. It was the moment investigators unknowingly encountered Michelle. Between those dates was a gap of only a few months, but that gap became the central mystery of the investigation. What happened during those months? How did Michelle leave Fresno? How did she end up in Kern County? And how did her life end with her remains hidden beneath the soil of a vineyard? Those questions are now at the center of an investigation that has survived for almost 50 years. The discovery of Michelle's identity does not automatically reconstruct her final day. It gives investigators the ability to ask better questions, but the answers still have to come from evidence. And in a case, this old evidence is complicated by time. In 1978, investigators could not have known that the victim they were examining would remain unidentified for nearly 5 decades. They could not have anticipated the development of forensic genetic genealogy. They could not have predicted that DNA recovered decades later might eventually provide the first major breakthrough. The original investigators were working with the science and resources available to them. The limitations of that era became part of the case itself. When the remains were discovered, the immediate task was to determine who the victim was and what had happened to her. The burial site provided the first physical location associated with her death, but without an identity, investigators could not easily reconstruct the events that came before it. This is one of the fundamental problems in unidentified homicide investigations. The victim's life is often the map that leads investigators to the killer. Friends, relatives, co-workers, neighbors, and acquaintances can provide information about the victim's movements and relationships. A missing person report can establish when someone was last seen. A photograph can trigger recognition. Personal belongings can provide clues. But if the victim has no name, those investigative doors remain closed. That is why the identification of Michelle was such a significant turning point. Suddenly, the investigation had a human history attached to it. Michelle was 15 years old. She was from Fresno. She disappeared in February 1978. Her remains were later found near Arvin. These facts could finally be connected, yet the investigators still faced the challenge of reconstructing a world that had disappeared. 48 years had passed. People had grown old. Some had died. Places had changed. Memories had faded. The teenager who disappeared in 1978 could no longer be questioned. The people around her at the time might remember only fragments, but fragments can sometimes become important when they are placed into the right timeline. A single memory may seem insignificant until investigators know exactly who they are looking for. The identification, therefore, created an opportunity to revisit information that had once seemed disconnected. When Michelle was still Jane Doe, investigators could only ask, "Who is this girl?" After the DNA identification, they could ask, what was happening in Michelle's life immediately before she disappeared? That is a far more focused question. It allows investigators to examine her known connections, her movements, and the circumstances of her disappearance. It also allows them to compare those details with the location where she was eventually found. The geography matters. Michelle disappeared from Fresno. Her remains were discovered near Arvin in Kern County. The distance between those places becomes part of the investigative puzzle. How she traveled from one location to the other is a question that may never be answered completely unless new evidence emerges. But investigators can now consider the question in relation to a specific person rather than an unknown victim. That distinction can change the value of old information. A person who remembered seeing Michelle in 1978 may have never known that the Jane Doe case involved her. A witness who heard about an unidentified teenager might have assumed the victim was someone else. Now the cases are connected. The identity creates a bridge between memories that may have remained separate for decades. There is also another important factor. Michelle's family had spent decades without knowing where she was. The identification gives them an answer, but it also demonstrates how much time was lost. For almost half a century, they could not visit a known grave. They could not know what had happened. They could not fully understand whether Michelle had been taken somewhere, whether she had left voluntarily, or whether something terrible had happened to her. The truth was, waiting in an investigation they could not see. The Jane Doe buried at Arvin Cemetery was Michelle. The teenager they were missing had been found, but the connection remained hidden because the forensic technology of the time could not establish it. That is why the 2007 exhumation is such an important part of the case. Investigators recognized that modern DNA testing offered a new opportunity. The remains were recovered from the cemetery so biological material could be analyzed. The case was brought into the era of genetic evidence, but again, science could only take the investigators so far. The DNA profile did not immediately produce a match. The mystery survived. In 2015, the facial reconstruction represented another attempt to bring the public into the investigation. A reconstructed image could potentially produce the recognition that science had failed to generate. But again, no definitive identification followed. The case remained unresolved until the next generation of forensic techniques became available. By the time investigators turned to advanced DNA analysis and genetic genealogy, Michelle had been unidentified for almost 50 years. The scale of the passage of time was enormous. A case that began with paper files and physical evidence was now being examined through sophisticated genetic technology. Othram's work to develop a forensic DNA profile gave investigators the biological information necessary to pursue genetic genealogy. That process eventually led to Michelle's identification. The breakthrough demonstrated something important about cold cases. They are not always solved because investigators suddenly discover new evidence. Sometimes they are solved because old evidence becomes useful in a new way. The remains had existed for decades. The biological material had existed for decades. The investigation itself had existed for decades. What changed was the ability to interpret those materials. The DNA did not appear in 2026. It had been there all along. What changed was the science capable of turning it into a lead. That is one of the most extraordinary aspects of Michelle's case. The passage of time did not destroy the evidence completely. Instead, it created a situation in which future technology could eventually unlock information that the original investigators could not access. The same evidence that once produced silence could now produce a name. But the identification also creates a warning. DNA can identify a person, but it does not necessarily tell the entire story of a crime. The genetic profile could lead investigators to Michelle, but the circumstances surrounding her death still require separate investigation. That distinction is critical. The scientific breakthrough solved the identity problem. It did not solve the homicide. The killer remains unidentified publicly. The case remains open, and investigators still need to determine how Michelle died and who was responsible. That means the next stage of the investigation may depend on more traditional detective work. Interviews, records, timelines, relationships, historical evidence, the reconstruction of Michelle's final known movements. Every surviving detail could matter. Cold cases are often solved through combinations of old and new technique. DNA can open the door, but investigators still have to walk through it. Michelle's case now stands at that doorway. For nearly 50 years, investigators were trying to identify the girl in the grave. Now they know. That changes the emotional center of the case as well. Jane Doe was a mystery. Michelle is a person. Her name can be spoken. Her family can remember her. Her life can be reconstructed. Her disappearance can be examined not simply as an unexplained event, but as something that happened to a specific 15-year-old girl. The case now has a victim whose story can be told, and that makes the unresolved questions even more painful. Somewhere in the history of February 1978, there may be a detail that has never been understood. Somewhere there may be a witness who remembers something differently today than they did decades ago. Somewhere there may be a record that was overlooked. Somewhere there may be someone who knows more than they have ever admitted. The person responsible for Michelle's death may have believed that the passage of time would make the crime impossible to solve. For almost 50 years, it seemed that way. But the identification of Michelle proved that time does not always win. Technology changed the balance. The evidence survived. The victim's identity returned, and now the investigation has another chance. Not a guarantee, not a promise of an immediate arrest, but a chance. Michelle's name has been recovered from the silence. Her story has been separated from the label Jane Doe. The grave has a name. The family has an answer. And the case has a new question written across it in unmistakable terms. Who killed Michelle Louise Collier? Nearly half a century ago, someone knew the answer. Today, investigators are still searching for the evidence that can finally make that secret speak. The discovery of Michelle Louise Collier's identity did something that no photograph, no reconstruction, and no earlier DNA search had been able to accomplish. It turned an unidentified homicide into a case with a known victim, a known family, and a documented disappearance. But that breakthrough also exposed the enormous amount of history that had been lost during the decades when Michelle was known only as Jane Doe. In a modern investigation, the first hours after a disappearance can be critical. Phones can be checked, security footage can be preserved, messages can be examined, financial transactions can establish movements, witnesses can be interviewed while memories are fresh. Vehicles can be located, digital records can create a timeline almost minute by minute. None of that existed when Michelle disappeared in February 1978. Investigators were working in an era when information moved slowly and records were largely physical. A teenager could vanish, and the trail could become cold long before investigators had enough information to understand what had happened. Michelle's disappearance became exactly that kind of mystery. She was gone. And then months later, a teenage girl's remains were discovered in a shallow grave near Arvin. But because investigators could not identify the remains, they could not prove that the missing girl from Fresno and the Jane Doe from Kern County were the same person. That disconnect lasted for decades. The original investigation, therefore, had to operate within the limitations of its time. Investigators examined the remains and attempted to determine who the victim was. The circumstances of the burial made clear that this was not an ordinary missing person case. Someone had placed the body underground. The victim had not simply disappeared without explanation. She had become the center of a homicide investigation. But the investigation was missing the one thing that could have opened countless doors: her identity. The remains were eventually buried at Arvin Cemetery. For years, the unidentified teenager existed in the records as a case without a name. The grave became a physical marker of an unanswered question. Somewhere, perhaps, someone was still looking for her, but investigators had no way to tell that family where she was. The passage of time made the situation even more difficult. Every year reduced the chance that an eyewitness would remember precise details. People moved away. Relationships changed. Records aged. Investigators retired. Yet the case did not completely disappear. The remains were preserved, and the possibility of future identification remained. In 2007, investigators returned to that possibility. Nearly 30 years after the discovery, they exhumed the remains to obtain biological material for DNA testing. This was a major turning point in the history of the case. Even though it did not immediately produce the answer, the science of forensic DNA had advanced dramatically since 1978. Investigators could now create a genetic profile from evidence that earlier detectives could never have used in the same way. The remains were tested, and the profile was submitted to the California Department of Justice, but the database did not provide a direct identification. The result was frustrating but important. Investigators now had a biological profile belonging to the victim. They still did not have her name. It was another reminder that technology is only as useful as the information available for comparison. A DNA profile can be extraordinarily precise, but if there is no known relative or matching profile, the victim can remain unidentified. The Jane Doe case survived. Then came the 2015 facial reconstruction. The reconstructed face gave the public another opportunity to recognize the victim. It was an attempt to put humanity back into a case that had been reduced to skeletal remains and investigative records. A face could be remembered. A face could be compared with old photographs. A face could trigger a memory that a description could not. Yet again, the case did not immediately break. Michelle remained unidentified. The years continued to pass, but forensic science continued moving forward. Genetic genealogy became increasingly important in cold case investigations involving unidentified victims. Traditional DNA databases depend heavily on known profiles. If a victim has no close relative in the database, a search may return nothing. Genetic genealogy works differently. It can reveal biological relationships that may extend across branches of a family tree. Investigators can then use genealogical research to determine where the victim might fit. This method created a new possibility for Michelle's case. The biological evidence had already survived decades. Now investigators had a way to search for family connections that earlier investigators could not have imagined. In 2025, the case entered this new phase. Advanced testing was pursued, and Othram worked with the genetic evidence to develop a profile suitable for investigative genetic genealogy. The Kern County Sheriff's Office and California Department of Justice were involved in the renewed investigation. The work was not simply about producing a DNA result. It required interpretation. It required researchers to follow genetic connections and determine which family relationships could potentially lead to the unidentified teenager. Every branch of a family tree could create new possibilities. Every possibility had to be tested against the known fact. The process eventually led to Michelle Louise Collier, a 15-year-old girl from Fresno, a teenager who had disappeared in February 1978, a young victim whose remains were discovered near Arvin months later. The identification was announced in 2026, almost 48 years after her remains were found. The discovery closed one of the oldest unanswered questions in the case, but it also changed the emotional meaning of the investigation. For decades, Michelle's family did not know where she was. The possibility of finding her remained open. The identification removed that uncertainty permanently. The missing girl had been found. She had been found decades earlier. She had simply been buried under another name. The Jane Doe label had hidden her from the people who were searching for her. Modern science finally removed that barrier. Yet the case did not become easier in every respect. In some ways, the identification made the remaining mystery more painful. Now there was no uncertainty about who the victim was. There was only uncertainty about who had killed her. The public record does not identify a perpetrator. There is no announced arrest connected to Michelle's death. The homicide remains unresolved. That means investigators still have to reconstruct what happened before and after her disappearance. The most important timeline begins in February 1978. Michelle disappeared from Fresno. Months later, her remains were discovered near Arvin. The distance between those locations and the circumstances surrounding the burial are part of the mystery. Investigators now have the ability to examine those facts through the lens of Michelle's identity. The question becomes more precise. Who was around Michelle before she disappeared? What relationships did she have? Where was she expected to be? What did people remember about her final days? Did anyone see her after she was reported missing? Did anyone know she had traveled toward Kern County? Did someone know where she was buried? Those questions may have been impossible to ask effectively while the victim was unidentified. Now they can be asked directly. But time has created a second problem. A witness who was 20 years old in 1978 would now be approaching 70. Someone who was 30 would now be approaching 80. Others may no longer be alive. The investigators who originally handled the case are no longer working it. The people who first examined the grave may have retired decades ago. The world surrounding the crime has changed. The vineyard may look different. Roads may have changed. Buildings may have disappeared. Yet the evidence that remains can still matter. A cold case does not necessarily become impossible with age. Sometimes the passage of time allows technology to catch up with preserved evidence. Michelle's identification is proof of that. The DNA that ultimately helped identify her was connected to a case that began before modern DNA profiling became a routine investigative tool. Her remains had survived. The biological evidence had survived. The case file had survived. And when the right technology became available, investigators could return to it. This is what makes cold cases so unusual. They can appear completely dormant while remaining scientifically active. An investigation may seem frozen to the outside world, but evidence can wait. Technology can change. Databases can expand. New forensic techniques can emerge. A case that once had no path forward can suddenly acquire one. Michelle's identity demonstrates that possibility, but identification is only one stage of justice. Knowing the victim does not automatically reveal the killer. DNA genealogy can establish who someone is related to, but it does not by itself tell investigators who committed a homicide. The remaining investigation requires evidence connecting a person to Michelle's death. That could involve forensic evidence, historical records, witness information, admissions, or other investigative findings. Nothing should be assumed before it is proven. The unanswered questions must remain unanswered until evidence resolves them. That is especially important in a case where almost 5 decades have passed. Speculation can easily become mistaken for fact. A name appearing somewhere in a family tree is not the same as identifying a murderer. A person who knew Michelle is not automatically a suspect. A location connected to the case does not automatically reveal who was responsible. The investigation must separate possibility from proof. Michelle's story now demands exactly that kind of careful reconstruction. Her identity has been restored. Her family knows where she was. Her grave has a name, but the person who placed her there remains unknown publicly. Somewhere in the surviving history of 1978 may be the key. It may be buried inside an old report. It may exist in a memory that has never been shared. It may be contained within evidence that modern science can now analyze more effectively. Or it may depend on someone who has carried the truth for decades finally deciding that silence is no longer possible. For almost 50 years, Michelle was a name nobody could recover. Now her name is known. The next step is to recover the truth behind it. For almost 5 decades, Michelle Louise Collier existed in 2 separate worlds. In one, she was a missing teenager from Fresno, a 15-year-old girl whose disappearance left the family with unanswered questions. In the other, she was Jane Doe, an unidentified homicide victim discovered in a vineyard near Arbor. The 2 identities belonged to the same person, but for decades investigators could not prove it. That separation is what made the case so difficult and what makes the eventual DNA breakthrough so significant. The discovery of Michelle's identity did not simply add a name to an old case file. It connected to investigations that had been separated by time, geography, and technology. Suddenly, the girl who disappeared in February 1978 and the teenager whose remains were discovered on June 21st of the same year were one and the same. That connection created an investigative timeline that had never been available before. But a timeline is only useful when investigators can fill it with evidence. The central mystery remains what happened between Michelle's disappearance and the discovery of her remains. Her life before that point becomes essential. Her movements become important. Her relationships become relevant. The people who knew her may hold pieces of a story that was never assembled while she was unidentified. In a case that has survived this long, even seemingly ordinary details can become significant because investigators now know exactly whose story they are trying to reconstruct. When Michelle disappeared, the world had no way of knowing that her remains would later be found in Kern County. The people who searched for her could not connect the disappearance to an unidentified victim. The investigators who found the remains could not connect the body to Michelle. That disconnect effectively divided the evidence. One investigation was looking for a missing girl. The other was trying to identify a dead teenager. Neither side had the missing piece. The problem persisted because the technology required to connect the 2 cases did not yet exist. Fingerprints and dental records did not provide the necessary identification. Later, when investigators returned to the case in 2007, modern DNA testing created a new opportunity. The remains were exhumed so biological evidence could be collected. The resulting DNA profile was submitted to the California Department of Justice, but it did not immediately produce a match. The profile was there, waiting, yet there was no name attached to it. This is an important part of the story because it demonstrates how many times the case came close to a solution without actually reaching one. The evidence had survived. The victim's biological identity had survived, but the connection to her family remained out of reach. In 2015, investigators attempted another route by creating a forensic facial reconstruction. The reconstructed face gave the unidentified teenager a visual identity. At least approximately, it offered the public something recognizable. But recognition did not come. The case continued. Years passed again. Then forensic investigative genetic genealogy changed what was possible. The basic principle was revolutionary in its simplicity. If investigators could not find a direct DNA match to the unidentified victim, perhaps they could find relatives. A distant genetic relationship could become the first thread. From that thread, researchers could build a family tree. The family tree could then be compared with the known circumstances of the unidentified person. In a case like Michelle's, that meant the possibility of moving from anonymous DNA to a specific family. The work required specialized laboratory testing and careful genealogical research. In 2025, investigators pursued advanced DNA analysis with the help of Othram. The laboratory was able to develop the forensic genetic information necessary for investigative genealogy. The effort involved the Kern County Sheriff's Office, the California Department of Justice, and National Missing Person Resource. The investigation was no longer limited to the databases available to detectives decades earlier. It could now explore biological relationships across generations. Slowly, the unidentified teenager began to emerge from the data. The process ultimately led to Michelle Louise Collier. The announcement in 2026 ended one of the most painful uncertainties surrounding the case. Michelle was no longer an unidentified victim. She was a 15-year-old girl from Fresno who had disappeared in February 1978. The remains found near Arvin were hers. The grave at Arvin Cemetery was hers. The Jane Doe file belonged to her. For the first time in nearly half a century, her family could place her name alongside the evidence. But the identification also forced investigators to confront the enormous passage of time. 48 years is longer than many entire careers. It is longer than the childhood and adulthood of an entire generation. Someone who was a child when Michelle disappeared could now be approaching retirement age. Someone who was an adult witness in 1978 could now be elderly or gone. The people who once knew the details of Michelle's life may have forgotten them. The people who knew something about her death may have spent decades believing that no one would ever ask again. That is one reason. The identification matters so much now. It gives investigators the ability to return to the case with a precise target. Instead of searching for any missing teenage girl who could fit the unidentified remains, they can focus on Michelle's known life. They can examine the people who knew her. They can review the circumstances of her disappearance. They can revisit records and information from the period with a clearer understanding of who the victim was. The case has a new center of gravity, yet there is another reality. Cold cases do not automatically become easier because a victim is identified. In some respects, the investigation becomes more complicated. Once the identity is known, the number of possible explanations expand. Investigators must determine which pieces of information are reliable and which may have been distorted by decades of memory. A witness may remember an event, but misremember the date. Another person may remember Michelle being somewhere but not remember exactly when. An old document may contain an error. A secondhand story may have changed over the years. Investigators must separate evidence from recollection and fact from assumption. The goal is not simply to construct a compelling story. It is to reconstruct what can actually be proven. That distinction becomes especially important because Michelle's case remains unresolved. No publicly announced suspect has been identified as her killer. No arrest has ended the investigation. The identity breakthrough, therefore, cannot be mistaken for a murder solution. Michelle has been identified, but justice has not yet been completed. Her family has received an answer about what happened to their missing teenager, but they still lack the answer to the most important question. Who was responsible? That question may require a different kind of breakthrough. The genetic genealogy that identified Michelle may eventually help generate investigative leads, but identifying the victim and identifying the perpetrator are two separate tasks. Investigators may need to examine historical evidence, surviving forensic material, witness accounts, and records from 1978. They may need to identify people who were connected to Michelle or the location where she was found. They may need to reconstruct the timeline of her disappearance and determine how she could have traveled from Fresno to Kern County. Every possibility has to be tested against evidence. Nothing can simply be assumed because it appears plausible. The vineyard itself remains one of the most important physical locations in the story. It was there that the tractor operator unknowingly disturbed the grave and brought a hidden crime to the surface. Before that moment, Michelle had been concealed underground. Whoever buried her had apparently expected the location to remain undisturbed, but the tractor changed everything. The soil was disturbed. The remains were discovered. Investigators were brought in. The existence of the crime became known. Yet the person responsible was never publicly identified. The discovery was both a breakthrough and the beginning of another mystery. Investigators knew they had a victim. They knew someone had buried her, but they did not know her name, her history, or the circumstances that had brought her there. Now, almost 50 years later, those missing pieces are beginning to reconnect. Michelle's identity creates the possibility of revisiting the entire case with new information that once appeared unrelated may become relevant. Old records can be re-examined. People can be asked questions that were impossible to ask before. And modern forensic science can be applied to evidence that has survived for decades. The passage of time has destroyed some information, but it has also created opportunity. Databases are larger. Genetic technology is more advanced. Investigators have more experience with cold cases. The methods used to identify unidentified victims have transformed dramatically. Michelle's case is evidence of that transformation. In 1978, the investigators could not give the victim her name. In 2007, DNA could be recovered, but could not produce an immediate match. In 2015, a face could be reconstructed, but still did not generate recognition. In 2025 and 2026, advanced genetic methods finally connected the victim to her family. It took decades, but the evidence finally spoke. And when it did, it revealed not a mysterious unknown woman, but a 15-year-old girl whose family had been waiting for answers. The name Michelle Louise Collier now stands where Jane Doe once stood, but the story does not become complete simply because the name has returned. A name tells investigators who the victim was. It does not tell them why she died. It does not identify the person who buried her. It does not explain what happened in the final hours of her life. Those answers remain somewhere beyond the breakthrough, and after almost 50 years, the investigation now faces the most difficult challenge of all, turning identification into accountability. The person responsible may have believed that the passage of time had erased the trail, but the case has already demonstrated the opposite. Evidence can wait. Technology can change. A buried identity can return, and once a victim has a name again, the past can become dangerous for anyone who has spent decades believing that the truth would remain buried with her. The case of Michelle Louise Collier had spent decades trapped between two realities. In one reality, a family was missing a 15-year-old girl. In the other, law enforcement had the remains of an unidentified teenager buried in Kern County. For almost 50 years, those realities could not be connected. Then modern genetic science finally built the bridge. But once Michelle's identity was confirmed, the investigation entered a different and potentially more difficult phase. Finding a victim's name is one problem. Finding the person responsible for her death is another. The first problem can sometimes be solved by biology. The second requires evidence that connects a specific individual to a specific crime. And after nearly half a century, that distinction becomes critical. Michelle's case is now no longer about whether Jane Doe can be identified. She can't. It is about whether the surviving evidence can reveal what happened to her and who was responsible. That question takes investigators back to the beginning. February 1978. Fresno, a 15-year-old girl disappears at the time. There was no way for investigators to know that months later, human remains would be found in a vineyard near Arvin. There was no way to know that the victim would remain unidentified for decades. There was no way to know that DNA technology would eventually transform the investigation. The disappearance would have been investigated using the tools of the time: interviews, physical records, missing person information, witness accounts. Investigators would have tried to establish where Michelle had been and when she was last seen. But without a body identified as Michelle, the investigation could not be fully connected to the later homicide discovery. That separation may have had enormous consequences. When investigators found the remains on June 21st, SIL 1978, they were dealing with an unidentified young female. They did not know that a 15-year-old from Fresno had disappeared months earlier. The missing person investigation and the unidentified remains investigation, therefore, developed separately. The connection existed only in reality. On paper, it did not. This is one of the most frustrating aspects of historical cold cases. The evidence may be present, but the connections between pieces of evidence can remain invisible. A missing person can have a family. An unidentified victim can have a grave. Yet, without an identifying link, those two investigations may never meet. Michelle's case remained in that state for decades. The victim was eventually buried at Arvin Cemetery. The family continued without answers, and the investigative file remained open in the background. The passage of time might have suggested that the case was becoming less solvable, but forensic science was moving in the opposite direction. In 2007, investigators exhumed the remains. The purpose was clear: recover biological material that could be subjected to modern DNA testing. The case was being pulled out of the past and placed into a new scientific environment. The DNA profile was submitted to the California Department of Justice, but the search did not immediately identify Michelle. That result could have been devastating. The evidence had been recovered. The technology existed, yet the name remained missing. Still, the DNA profile was valuable. It preserved a biological record that could potentially be revisited as databases and methods improved. That would become important later. In 2015, investigators created a forensic facial reconstruction. The reconstructed image gave the public a new way to see the unidentified victim. It was an attempt to transform skeletal evidence into a recognizable face, but again, the identity remained unknown. The case was still waiting for the right connection. The breakthrough eventually came through a new generation of genetic investigation. Investigative genetic genealogy had begun changing cold case work by allowing investigators to search for relatives rather than requiring a direct match. The approach could turn an unidentified DNA profile into a family network. From that network, investigators could work toward a specific individual. For Michelle, the process became possible after advanced testing was performed on evidence from the case. In 2025, investigators worked with Othram to develop the forensic genetic profile necessary for genealogy. The Kern County Sheriff's Office and California Department of Justice were part of the investigation. The goal was no longer simply to compare the victim's DNA against a limited database. The goal was to uncover family connection. The genetic information could reveal biological relationships. Those relationships could then be researched through genealogical records. A family tree could be constructed. Potential identities could be evaluated. Eventually, the evidence pointed toward Michelle Louise Collier. The announcement in 2026 finally connected the missing teenager from Fresno with the unidentified victim from Kern County. The discovery was extraordinary. The girl who had vanished in 1978 had not simply disappeared into history. She had been found months later. Her remains had been recovered and buried, but her identity had been lost. The family had spent decades without knowing. The investigators had spent decades without knowing. Now everyone knew. Michelle had been found, but she had been murdered. That realization transformed the emotional landscape of the case. For decades, the family had lived with uncertainty. Now there was certainty, but it came with grief. The identification could not bring Michelle back. It could only tell her family where she had been and confirm that she had died almost 50 years earlier. Yet there is another important consequence. Identification can give investigators access to a victim's history. Before Michelle's identity was known, detectives could not confidently connect the Jane Doe remains to people who had known Michelle. Now they can. They can ask who knew her. They can examine the circumstances of her disappearance. They can reconstruct the timeline surrounding February 1978. They can potentially revisit people and places that were previously outside the unidentified victim investigation. The case now has a direction, but the direction is not the same as an answer. Investigators still need to determine what happened between Michelle's disappearance and the discovery of her remains. The public record does not provide a complete account of those events. That means the most dramatic questions remain unanswered. Who was the last person known to see Michelle? What circumstances surrounded her disappearance? How did she get from Fresno to the area near Arvin? Who knew where she was? Who knew about the burial site? Did the person responsible act alone? Was anyone else aware of what happened? These questions should not be answered through speculation. Almost 50 years of uncertainty creates a temptation to fill the gaps with assumptions. But cold case investigations depend on evidence. A theory is not a fact. A possibility is not proof, and a person who appears in a historical record is not automatically responsible for a homicide. Investigators must build a case that can withstand scrutiny. That challenge is made harder by the age of the investigation. People who might have provided information in 1978 may no longer be available. Memories may be incomplete. Physical locations may have changed. Documents may have been lost, but not everything disappears with time. Some evidence can survive remarkably well. DNA is one example. Michelle's identity proves that. The biological evidence recovered from the remains existed for decades before investigators had the ability to use it effectively. The technology changed, not the evidence. That principle may be important in the next stage of the case. If biological evidence connected to the crime still exists, modern forensic methods could potentially provide information that was impossible to obtain decades ago. Investigators today have tools that did not exist in 1978. They can analyze genetic material at levels that earlier laboratories could not. They can search databases that have grown dramatically. They can use genealogical techniques to identify relationships. They can revisit evidence with knowledge gained from thousands of other cold cases. But science cannot manufacture evidence that no longer exists. That is why preservation matters. The fact that Michelle's remains were preserved long enough for modern DNA testing to identify her is itself significant. It demonstrates the value of maintaining evidence even when a case appears to have reached a dead end. A case can be dormant without being dead. That is exactly what happened here. The Jane Doe case survived. The biological evidence survived. The investigative file survived. Eventually, the science caught up. Now investigators face a new task, determining whether the same evidence or other surviving evidence can help identify Michelle's killer. The answer is unknown. There is no publicly announced perpetrator. There is no known arrest. There is no confirmed resolution of the homicide. The case remains active. That means every new piece of information matters. A family connection can matter. A historical record can matter. A forgotten photograph can matter. A person who remembers Michelle can matter. A statement made decades ago can matter. A piece of physical evidence preserved since 1978 can matter. The identification has opened all of those possibilities. Before the DNA breakthrough, investigators were searching for a girl whose name they did not know. Now they are searching for the circumstances surrounding the death of Michelle Louise Collier. That difference is enormous. It turns an anonymous case into a personal one. It gives investigators a victim whose life can be reconstructed. It gives the family a story that can finally be told. And it gives the investigation a chance to ask questions that were impossible to ask for decades. But the passage of time has not disappeared. Nearly 50 years still stand between the investigators of 1978 and the investigators of today. That time has taken away information, memories, and people, yet it has also created something else. Perspective. The world now knows that cold cases can survive long enough to be transformed by science. Michelle's identification is proof. A teenager who had been nameless since 1978 now has her name back. The grave has an identity. The family has an answer. and the case has a renewed purpose. But the most important questions still wait. Somewhere in the distance between Fresno and Arvin, between February and June of 1978, between the last known moments of Michelle's life and the discovery of her grave, something happened. The person responsible has never been publicly named. For decades, the silence held. Now, Michelle's name has broken that silence. The next breakthrough, if it comes, will have to do more than identify a victim. It will have to explain what happened to her. The moment Michelle Louise Collier was identified, the case changed from an anonymous mystery into a personal investigation. For nearly half a century, investigators had been searching for the identity of a teenage girl whose remains were found in a vineyard outside Arvin. Now they knew her name. They knew she had been 15 years old. They knew she had disappeared from Fresno in February 1978. They knew that the remains discovered on June 21st, still 1978, belonged to her. But knowing who the victim was did not automatically reveal the path that led to her death. In fact, the identification exposed the enormous gap that still existed between the beginning and the end of the story. Michelle had a life before she disappeared. Someone knew that life. Someone knew her relationships, her routines, the people around her, and perhaps the circumstances surrounding her final day. Those details had been separated from the homicide investigation for decades because investigators did not know the victim was Michelle. Now those details could become evidence. That is why identification is such a powerful turning point in a cold case. It does not simply answer a question. It changes every question that follows. Before the breakthrough, investigators could only ask who Jane Doe was. After the breakthrough, they could ask who Michelle was, where she had been, who knew her, and what happened immediately before she disappeared. The difference is enormous. A victim's identity creates a framework. It creates relationship. It creates dates, places, memories, and records that can potentially be examined. But nearly 50 years had passed since Michelle disappeared. That passage of time created an extraordinary challenge. The investigators of 2026 were not standing in the same world as the investigators of 1978. The landscape had changed. Technology had changed. People had changed. Some of the people who knew Michelle may no longer be alive. Others may have forgotten details they once considered unforgettable, and some memories may have been altered by decades of distance. Yet the disappearance itself remained fixed in time. Michelle was 15 when she vanished. Her remains were discovered months later. Those facts cannot change. The challenge is reconstructing everything between them. In 1978, investigators did not have the technological tools available today. There were no mobile phone records, no digital photographs with embedded timestamp, no internet searches that could instantly reveal connections, no social media history, no massive genealogical databases. Information had to be collected manually. Interviews were conducted in person. Records had to be requested and physically reviewed. Evidence had to be preserved carefully because there was no guarantee that future technology would be able to recover information from it. When the remains were discovered near Arvin, investigators could document the scene, recover evidence, and attempt to identify the victim. But the lack of a name placed a severe limitation on the investigation. They could not simply contact Michelle's family because they did not know which family to contact. They could not ask her friends what she had been doing before her disappearance. They could not compare the victim's circumstances with a specific missing person report. They had a homicide victim without a biography. That problem lasted for decades. In 2007, investigators attempted to break the deadlock by exhuming the remains and obtaining DNA. The effort produced a genetic profile, but not a direct identification. The evidence had spoken, but the database could not translate it into a name. In 2015, the facial reconstruction provided another potential path. The reconstructed face offered the public an opportunity to recognize the teenager. But again, the answer remained out of reach. Then the science of genetic genealogy opened another door. By examining genetic relationships rather than simply searching for a direct match, investigators could potentially identify relatives of the unknown victim. A family tree could become the map. A distant relative could provide the first connection. Genealogical research could narrow the possibilities until investigators reached a specific identity. In 2025, advanced DNA work with Othram helped create the profile necessary for that process. The Kern County Sheriff's Office and California Department of Justice continued the effort. The investigation eventually led to Michelle. In 2026, the teenager once known only as Jane Doe was identified as Michelle Louise Collier. The news was a breakthrough, but it was also a reminder of what the family had lost. Michelle had been missing for almost 50 years. Her loved ones had lived through decades of uncertainty without knowing that she had already been found. The remains discovered in 1978 were not some unknown person who had appeared from nowhere. They were Michelle. The answer had existed in the evidence for decades. It simply could not be connected to her family. That fact makes the identification especially haunting. Imagine the possibility that the family could have driven past the area where Michelle was buried without ever knowing. Imagine the photograph of an unidentified teenager existing somewhere in an old case file while the people who loved her were still asking where she had gone. Imagine investigators possessing her remains, but not her name. The tragedy was not only that Michelle had died, it was that her identity had been lost along with her life. Modern DNA finally restored it, but the case now faces the most difficult stage. Identification tells investigators who the victim was. It does not prove who killed her. The homicide remains unresolved publicly. There is no announced perpetrator. No arrest has been reported. No court has established responsibility. That means the investigation must now move beyond identification and into reconstruction. What happened to Michelle before she disappeared? What circumstances led her away from Fresno? What happened after she vanished? How did her remains reach the vineyard? Who had access to the burial location? Are not questions that can be answered by DNA alone. They require a complete investigative picture. That picture may have to be assembled from pieces scattered across nearly 5 decades. Old reports may contain information that was never connected to the Jane Doe case. People who knew Michelle may remember details that were never included in the original investigation. A missing person report may contain clues that investigators could not appreciate without knowing the victim had been found. A location mentioned in an old document could become significant when compared with the place where her remains were discovered. The identification gives investigators a reason to look again, and looking again is often where cold cases begin to change. But investigators must also be careful. The passage of time can make speculation feel like evidence. A name in an old report may appear suspicious without actually being connected to the crime. A person who knew Michelle may become interesting to investigators without being a suspect. A location may appear significant simply because it is geographically close to the discovery site. None of those things establish guilt. A cold case investigation must distinguish between leads and proof. That is particularly important when the case is nearly 50 years old. The people involved cannot necessarily be confronted with fresh memories or modern evidence. Investigators have to work with what survived. The biological evidence that survived from Michelle's remains is one of the most important examples. The DNA did not solve the entire case, but it proved that old evidence can remain valuable. The same principle applies to other evidence. Something overlooked in 1978 might have greater significance today because investigators now understand how to interpret it. Something that could not be tested in 1978 might now be testable. A biological sample that once produced no result might be re-examined using newer methods. A record that once existed only on paper might now be searchable in digital archives. The investigation is therefore not necessarily limited to the tools of 1978. It can use the knowledge of 2026 to reconsider the evidence of 1978. That is what makes the case different now. For decades, the central problem was identity. Investigators could not move fully into the victim's history because they did not know who she was. That barrier has been removed. Michelle's identity creates an investigative foundation. Her family history can be documented. Her disappearance can be reconstructed. The people around her can be identified. The timeline can be rebuilt. The investigation can ask questions that were impossible to ask before. And that process may reveal something that was hidden in plain sight. Perhaps someone remembers seeing Michelle in the days before she disappeared. Perhaps someone remembers a vehicle. Perhaps someone remembers a conversation. Perhaps an old acquaintance has information that was never considered relevant. Perhaps there is evidence preserved from the original investigation that can now be examined using modern forensic techniques. Or perhaps the breakthrough will come from someone who has carried knowledge of the crime for decades. Cold cases sometimes depend on the passage of time in unexpected ways. People change. Relationships change. Secrets become heavier. Someone who remains silent for years may eventually decide to speak. Someone who once protected another person may no longer have a reason to do so. Someone who believed the case would never be solved may realize that forensic science has changed. Michelle's identification sends a message that the past is not necessarily unreachable. The evidence survived. The victim was identified. The case moved again. That alone changes the psychological landscape surrounding an unsolved homicide. The person responsible, if still alive, may know that investigators are now looking at the case through a completely different lens. The victim has a name. The family knows. The investigators have new technology. The case is no longer an anonymous file. It is the story of Michelle Louise Collier, a 15-year-old girl whose life ended in circumstances that remain unresolved. The question now is whether the remaining evidence can bridge the final gap between her disappearance and the person responsible. The first gap was closed by DNA. The second may require something else. It may require another scientific breakthrough. It may require a forgotten witness. It may require a record hidden for decades. Or it may require someone to finally tell the truth. Whatever form that answer takes, the investigation has reached a point it had never reached before. For almost 50 years, Michelle's name was missing. Now her name is known. And when investigators say the case is still open, they are no longer searching for Jane Doe. They are searching for the person who killed Michelle Louise Collier. The identification of Michelle Louise Collier solved a mystery that had survived almost 50 years. But it also created a new urgency around everything that remained unknown. For decades, the investigation had been constrained by a single devastating fact. Nobody knew who the victim was. Now that barrier had disappeared, the teenager buried at Arvin Cemetery had a name. She had a family. She had a documented life in Fresno. She had a disappearance that could be placed against the discovery of her remains. And with that information, investigators could finally begin rebuilding the story from the victim outward. That process is at the heart of any cold case investigation. The victim is not simply the person found at the end of the story. The victim is often the key to everything that happened before the crime. Who knew her? Where did she spend time? Who did she trust? Who might have had access to her? What circumstances surrounded her disappearance? These questions become more important now because Michelle was only 15 years old when she vanished. The circumstances of a teenager's disappearance can involve a complex network of family, friends, acquaintances, and people encountered through everyday life. In 1978, investigators would have relied heavily on people remembering what they had seen and heard. Today, investigators have the ability to supplement those memories with modern forensic techniques, but the historical record still matters. Michelle's identification gives investigators a reason to return to that record. The case can now be examined with knowledge that was unavailable to detectives at the time. The missing teenager from Fresno and the unidentified victim from Kern County are no longer separate mysteries. They are one case. That connection may seem obvious now, but it was impossible to establish for decades. The remains were discovered on June 21st, Sill 1978, in a shallow grave in a vineyard near South Wheeler Ridge, road outside Arvin. The victim was young. She was eventually buried at Arvin Cemetery, but the investigators did not know they had found Michelle. Her family did not know Michelle had been found. The two sides of the case remained separated by the absence of identification. When the remains were exhumed in 2007, investigators were attempting to break that separation through DNA. The genetic profile was developed and submitted to the California Department of Justice, but no direct identification resulted. That failure did not mean the evidence was useless. It meant the technology and databases available at the time could not make the necessary connection. The case continued waiting. In 2015, a forensic facial reconstruction offered another potential route to recognition. The reconstructed face attempted to turn an unidentified set of remains into a person the public might recognize. But recognition did not come. The case remained unresolved. Then genetic genealogy created a new possibility. Instead of searching for a direct match, investigators could search for relatives. The DNA could potentially reveal a family network even when the victim herself was absent from conventional databases. In 2025, advanced testing in genetic genealogy became central to the renewed investigation. Othram worked with the available biological evidence to develop the forensic profile. The Kern County Sheriff's Office and California Department of Justice were involved in the effort. The investigation ultimately led to Michelle Louise Collier. The identification was announced in 2026. The result was extraordinary because it demonstrated that the evidence had never truly stopped existing. The biological information had been preserved. The case file had survived. The grave had remained part of the historical record. What changed was the ability to interpret the evidence. Modern science transformed an old biological sample into a family connection and eventually into a name. But now, investigators face a different problem. The identity of the victim is no longer a mystery, but the circumstances of her death remain unclear publicly. The person responsible has not been publicly identified. There has been no announced arrest. There has been no courtroom verdict. The homicide remains an open investigation. That means the next stage depends on reconstructing the events surrounding Michelle's disappearance. The timeline begins with her disappearance from Fresno in February 1978. It ends with the discovery of her remains near Arvin in June. The space between those two events is the critical period. Somewhere inside that gap is the story investigators need. But because the case is almost 50 years old, reconstruction will require patience and caution. Historical investigations are vulnerable to inaccurate memory. People remember events differently after decades. Some details become clearer with time. Others become distorted. A person may confidently remember something that happened in 1978, but unknowingly place it in the wrong month. Another person may remember a face, but not a name. A third may remember hearing something, but not remember who told them. Investigators have to compare those accounts with surviving records and physical evidence. The goal is not to create the most dramatic explanation. It is to establish what can actually be proven. That is especially important because a cold case can attract speculation. When a victim has been unidentified for decades, people naturally try to fill the gaps. But theories are not evidence. Suspicion is not proof. A person being connected to Michelle does not make that person responsible for her death. The investigation must remain grounded in facts. What investigators now possess is something incredibly valuable: a confirmed identity. Michelle's name provides a foundation for reviewing the original investigation. Her family history can be examined. Her disappearance can be compared with the unidentified remains. People who knew her can potentially be identified and interviewed. Records from the period can be revisited. The location where her remains were found can be studied in historical context, and forensic evidence can potentially be re-examined using modern technology. This is where the evolution of DNA science becomes particularly important. The original investigation could not use DNA profiling in the way modern investigators can. When the remains were exhumed in 2007, DNA testing produced a profile but not an identification. Today, forensic laboratories can extract and interpret genetic information from difficult samples using techniques that were unavailable decades ago. The successful identification of Michelle proves that the evidence preserved from the case still has scientific value. That raises an important possibility. If other biological evidence was preserved, modern testing might potentially provide information that earlier investigators could not obtain. But that possibility must remain exactly what it is, a possibility. There has been no public announcement establishing that new forensic testing has identified Michelle's killer. The identity breakthrough and the homicide solution are separate stages. Michelle has been identified. The killer has not been publicly identified. That distinction must remain clear. Yet even without a suspect, the identification itself changes the investigation's reach. The case can now be placed within Michelle's life. Investigators can ask who she was with before she disappeared. They can examine where she was expected to be. They can investigate whether anyone noticed unusual circumstances around the time she vanished. They can compare information from the original missing person investigation with the homicide evidence discovered months later. These questions could reveal connections that were invisible when the victim was unidentified. There is also the question of geography. Michelle disappeared from Fresno while her remains were discovered near Arvin. That geographical separation is part of the mystery. Investigators may need to reconstruct how Michelle could have traveled between those locations. The answer may depend on transportation, acquaintances, or circumstances that are no longer easy to document. In 1978, travel did not leave the digital traces that modern travel does. There were no smartphone location records, no GPS history, no digital traffic cameras preserving every movement. A person could travel across California without generating the electronic evidence investigators rely on today. That makes historical reconstruction especially difficult, but it does not make it impossible. Old photographs, letters, school records, employment records, family memories, police reports, and witness statements can all become pieces of a timeline. A cold case investigator is often forced to work like a historian and a detective at the same time. The goal is to reconstruct a vanished world accurately enough to identify the people and events surrounding the crime. Michelle's case now offers that opportunity. Her identity provides the anchor. Everything else can be organized around it. The question becomes whether enough of the old world remains to reveal what happened. Nearly 50 years is a long time for a secret to survive. People build new lives. They move. They marry. They have children. They change careers. They lose contact with old acquaintances. They may convince themselves that the past is no longer relevant. But a homicide does not disappear simply because people stop talking about it. The victim remains dead. The evidence remains part of the record, and sometimes the technology changes. Michelle's case demonstrates that the past can suddenly become active again. The identification in 2026 means that a case, once defined by anonymity, is now defined by a name. Michelle Louise Collier, 15 years old, missing in February 1978, found in a vineyard in June. Unknown for nearly 48 years, identified through modern forensic genetic investigation, her family finally knows what happened to their missing daughter. But the investigation still carries an unfinished sentence. Michelle was found. Michelle was identified. Michelle was returned to her name. But who killed Michelle? That question remains. And after decades of silence, the people who may know the answer are living in a world where DNA can expose identities that once seemed impossible to recover. The technology that found Michelle has already changed the case once. The question is whether another piece of evidence can change it again. There is a moment in every cold case when the investigation stops being a search through the past and becomes a confrontation with it. For Michelle Louise Collier, that moment came when science finally restored the name that had been missing from the case for nearly 5 decades. The teenager buried in Arvin Cemetery was no longer Jane Doe. She was Michelle, 15 years old when she disappeared. A real person with a family, a history, and a life that had been interrupted in 1978. But identification also changed the meaning of every unanswered question. Before the DNA breakthrough, investigators were trying to determine who the victim was. After the breakthrough, they could finally ask what happened to Michelle. Those are very different questions. The first can be answered through genetics. The second requires reconstruction, evidence, and time. And time is the one thing this investigation has never had on its side. Almost 50 years had passed since Michelle disappeared. The world around the case had changed beyond recognition. The technology available to investigators in 1978 was primitive compared with what exists today. Even the language of forensic science had changed. DNA profiling was not yet the tool that it would become. Genetic genealogy was decades away. Digital databases did not exist in their modern form. The investigation had been forced to survive in a world of paper records, physical photographs, handwritten notes, telephone calls, and memory. That reality matters because the first investigation could only follow the evidence it had. When Michelle's remains were discovered in a vineyard near Arvin on June 21st, SIL 1978, investigators had to start with an unknown victim. They knew they were dealing with a young female whose remains had been buried, but they did not know her name. They did not know that a 15-year-old girl from Fresno had disappeared months earlier. They could not connect the two cases. The missing girl and the unidentified victim existed in separate investigative worlds. That separation may be one of the most important facts in understanding why the case remained unsolved for so long. The investigators were not ignoring Michelle. They simply did not know they had found her. The remains were eventually buried at Arvin Cemetery, where the unidentified teenager remained for decades. But the case was never completely forgotten. In 2007, investigators returned to the remains. They exhumed the body and collected biological material for DNA analysis. It was a significant attempt to use modern science to break through an old mystery. A DNA profile was developed and submitted to the California Department of Justice. Yet the search did not immediately produce Michelle's identity. The technology had provided investigators with a genetic fingerprint, but there was no direct match. The case remained open. In 2015, investigators tried another approach. A forensic facial reconstruction was created, giving the public a visual representation of the unidentified teenager. It was another attempt to put a face to the unknown victim, but again, the breakthrough did not come. The case continued to wait. Then the science evolved again. Investigative genetic genealogy created a new method for unidentified remains cases. Instead of relying entirely on direct database matches, investigators could examine genetic relationships and search for distant relatives. A relative did not have to know the victim. The genetic connection could exist across generations. Genealogical research could then trace those relationships back through a family tree. It was a fundamentally different way of thinking about identification. The question was no longer simply, does this DNA match anyone? It became, who is this person's family? That change opened a new path for Michelle. In 2025, advanced DNA work was pursued with Othram, a forensic laboratory specializing in difficult DNA cases. The Kern County Sheriff's Office and the California Department of Justice continued the investigation. The goal was to extract and interpret the genetic information that had survived from the remains. Eventually, the evidence pointed toward Michelle Louise Collier. In 2026, the identification was confirmed. The discovery was remarkable because the evidence had been waiting for decades. Michelle's biological identity had been preserved, even though her personal identity had been lost. The DNA did not suddenly appear. It had been there all along. What changed was the technology capable of reading it. That distinction is at the heart of modern cold case investigation. The passage of time does not always destroy evidence. Sometimes it simply places evidence beyond the reach of the technology available at the time. Then science catches up. Michelle's case is a powerful example of that principle, but now the investigation must confront a much harder problem. A victim can be identified through biology. A killer must be connected through evidence. That requires more than a genetic family tree. It requires a sequence of events that can withstand scrutiny. It requires investigators to determine what happened to Michelle, who was involved, and whether physical or testimonial evidence can establish responsibility. The public record does not currently identify a perpetrator. There is no publicly announced arrest that resolves Michelle's homicide. Her killer remains unknown. That means the investigation is still unfinished, and the most important clues may now be hidden in the history surrounding Michelle's disappearance. Her identity allows investigators to revisit information that once seemed disconnected. The people who knew her can be identified. The circumstances of her disappearance can be reconstructed. Old reports can be reviewed with a new understanding of the victim. Information that once belonged only to a missing person case can now be compared with information from the unidentified remains investigation. This is where a cold case can suddenly become active again. One piece of information may have seemed meaningless in 1978 because investigators did not know the victim had been found. Another detail may have been recorded, but never connected to the homicide. A witness may have provided information without realizing its significance. A person who was interviewed decades ago may now remember a detail differently. Every possibility has to be evaluated carefully. The danger is that time can create false certainty. Human memory is not a recording device. After decades, people can remember events with confidence while unconsciously changing dates, locations, or sequences. Investigators therefore have to compare memories against documentary evidence and other independent information. They cannot simply accept the most compelling version of a story. The goal is accuracy, not drama. Michelle deserves nothing less. Her identification has already demonstrated the importance of accuracy. For almost 50 years, the victim was described through incomplete information. She was a Jane Doe. Now the historical record can finally be corrected. The same standard must apply to the rest of the case. Her killer cannot be identified through assumption. Responsibility cannot be assigned because someone seems suspicious. A person who knew Michelle is not automatically connected to her death. A person who lived near the discovery site is not automatically a suspect. Every conclusion must be supported by evidence. That principle becomes even more important as public attention returns to the case. The identification of Michelle has the power to generate new information. Someone who recognizes her story may remember something from 1978. Someone who knew her may realize that a detail they dismissed decades ago could matter. Someone who encountered an unidentified victim case years ago may now recognize the connection. The public can become part of the investigative process, but public attention can also produce misinformation. Old rumors can resurface. Unverified theories can spread. Names can be associated with crimes without evidence. That is why investigators must distinguish between a lead and a proven fact. A lead is something that can be investigated. Proof is something that can establish responsibility. The difference can determine whether a case truly moves forward. Michelle's case now has a lead that was impossible for decades. Her identity. That identity creates access to her family history and her personal history. It allows investigators to reconstruct her world. It also gives the public something that had been missing for almost 50 years, a name to remember. Michelle was not simply an unidentified teenager found in a vineyard. She was a 15-year-old girl whose disappearance created an unanswered wound in her family. The fact that her remains were discovered only months after she disappeared makes the story even more painful. She had been found, but nobody knew it was her. Her family was searching while her remains were already part of a homicide investigation. The connection remained invisible until modern DNA technology made it possible. Now the case has reached a new stage. The evidence can be viewed through Michelle's identity. Investigators can revisit the circumstances surrounding her disappearance. They can examine the historical record. They can consider whether surviving forensic evidence can be tested again. And they can search for people who may have information that was never known or never understood. The passage of time has created enormous obstacles, but it has also created a strange possibility. Someone who believed the case was permanently buried may now realize that the case has returned. The teenager who was once anonymous has a name again. Her family has answers that were unimaginable years ago. Investigators have technology that did not exist when she was killed, and the evidence that once seemed silent has already spoken once. It identified Michelle. The question is whether it can speak again, because the most important part of the case remains unresolved. Michelle's identity is no longer a mystery. Her death is. The person who placed her in that shallow grave has never been publicly identified. The reason she was killed remains unknown. The circumstances of her final days remain incomplete, and somewhere within the surviving evidence, the missing pieces may still exist. The case has already waited almost 50 years for one breakthrough. Now it is waiting for another. The difference is that this time investigators are not searching for Jane Doe. They know exactly who they are fighting to give justice to. Her name is Michelle Louise Collier, and after decades of silence, her story has finally returned to the center of the investigation. For nearly 50 years, the most important fact in the case was the one investigators could not establish, the identity of the victim. Everything else depended on it. The grave had been found. The remains had been recovered. The investigation had been opened, but without a name, the case could not fully connect to a family, a missing person report, or a known life. Now that Michelle Louise Collier has been identified, the investigation has crossed a line that once seemed impossible to reach. The unknown teenager has become a specific person. The unidentified remains have become the remains of a 15-year-old girl from Fresno, and the old case file now carries a name that had been missing for decades. But a name does not erase the passage of time. It does not restore the witnesses who may have disappeared from the record. It does not recreate the world of 1978. It does not automatically reveal who Michelle was with when her life came to an end. It simply gives investigators the starting point they never had before. That starting point is powerful because Michelle's identity creates a connection between her disappearance and the remains found months later. For decades, those two events existed separately. Now they form one continuous story. Michelle disappeared in February 1978. On June 21st of that year, the remains of an unidentified young female were discovered in a shallow grave near Arvin. The discovery was shocking enough on its own, but the later identification transformed its meaning completely. The girl in that grave was the teenager who had disappeared from Fresno. The discovery did not happen decades later. It happened in the same year. She vanished. The truth was physically present in the investigation almost from the beginning, but investigators could not recognize it. That is one of the most haunting realities of the case. Michelle was not lost because there was no evidence. She was lost because the available evidence could not be connected. The remains existed. The grave existed. The missing person case existed. What was missing was the bridge between them. That bridge eventually came through DNA, but the road to that breakthrough was long. In 2007, investigators exhumed Michelle's remains to obtain biological material for testing. The decision demonstrated that the case had not been forgotten. Modern forensic science was being brought into an investigation that had begun before DNA profiling had become a standard tool in criminal investigation. The testing produced a genetic profile, but the profile did not immediately identify the victim. It was another moment when science could provide information, but not yet provide the answer. In 2015, investigators attempted another method by creating a forensic facial reconstruction. The reconstructed face gave the unidentified teenager a visual identity that could potentially be recognized by someone who remembered her. But the hoped-for recognition did not come. The case remained unresolved. Then the development of investigative genetic genealogy changed what investigators could attempt. Instead of depending solely on a direct match in a traditional DNA database, investigators could look for genetic relatives and use those relationships to build a family tree. The technique could transform an anonymous biological profile into a genealogical pathway for unidentified victims that could mean the difference between another dead end and a real identity. In the renewed investigation, advanced DNA testing was pursued, with Othram involved in developing the genetic information needed for genealogy. The Kern County Sheriff's Office and the California Department of Justice were involved in the investigation.